Atlas started digging at 3:04 a.m., sharp right, through the kitchen floor of a collapsing cabin outside Missoula, Montana. Mason thought the old war dog smelled a rat. Then warm air came up through the cracks, and the dog wouldn't back away. What would you have done? The temperature outside the Walmart on Brook Street had dropped to 38 degrees by 9:48 p.m. Cold crept across the parking lot in thin silver layers, sliding over faded oil stains and abandoned shopping carts that rattled whenever the wind shifted down from the hills west of Missoula. A flickering light buzzed above the garden center entrance. Somewhere farther out near the loading docks, metal clanged once. That sound was enough. Mason Reed's eyes opened instantly. No confusion, no slow waking, just movement. His right hand slid beneath the folded army blanket beside him before his mind fully caught up. Fingers closed around the flashlight first. Then the knife taped beside it under the driver's seat. Atlas was already awake. The German Shepherd sat upright between the front seats of the old Chevy Suburban. Ears forward, body frozen stiff toward the fogged windshield. A low growl rolled quietly through his chest. Mason stayed still for 3 full seconds, listening. Wind across asphalt, a shopping cart wheel squeaking somewhere, the distant hum of Highway 93 traffic. Nothing else. Atlas didn't relax. Neither did Mason. The inside of the Suburban smelled like cold denim, old coffee, wet dog fur, and the faint chemical odor from the VA sleeping pills Mason stopped taking 3 months earlier. A wrinkled receipt from Town Pump rested near the dashboard. $4.83 for coffee and jerky at 6:12 a.m. yesterday morning. He remembered buying it, barely. Mason rubbed a hand over his face and checked the side mirror. Condensation blurred most of the parking lot outside, but he could still make out the silhouette of a man pushing carts near the far row. Not a threat. Atlas kept staring anyway. "It's clear," Mason muttered softly. The dog glanced back once but didn't fully settle. Old habits. Some habits stayed buried in muscle longer than memory itself. Mason shifted carefully in the back seat. His knees cracked. 14 months sleeping inside a vehicle had taught him exactly how to move without hitting the doorframe or waking with a locked spine. Boots still on. Jeans still on. Gray thermal shirt wrinkled beneath a weather-faded canvas jacket. Ready to move. Always. The phone buzzed suddenly beside him. Atlas flinched hard enough to bump the steering wheel. Mason grabbed the phone immediately before the light filled the vehicle. Unknown number. Missoula County area code. For a second, he considered ignoring it. Then he answered. "Reed." A pause. Static crackled softly through the speaker before a calm male voice came through. "Mr. Mason Reed? Yeah, this is Deputy Collins with the Missoula County Sheriff's Office. Sorry to contact you this late." Mason's eyes moved automatically toward the windshield again. "Go ahead." Another pause. Papers shuffled somewhere in the background. "We located your brother's identification earlier this week near Blackfoot River, road west of the Clearwater Junction hunting area. Your name was listed as next of kin." Mason didn't answer. The deputy continued carefully. "Your brother, Owen Reed, was found deceased approximately 3 months ago. Exposure appears to be the primary cause." Atlas slowly lowered his head onto the console between the seats. Outside, wind pushed a loose plastic bag across the parking lot. Mason stared through the fogged windshield without blinking. 3 months. Nobody had called for 3 months. The deputy kept talking. Voice professional, but quieter now. "We attempted contact using the Helena address we had on file. It came back vacant." "It is vacant." "Yes, sir." Silence again. Mason leaned back slowly against the cold window beside him. The glass pressed against the scar near his temple, the one hidden beneath short, gray-streaked hair. His breathing stayed even, but his left hand tightened around the flashlight until his knuckles whitened. He hadn't seen Owen in almost 6 years, not since their mother's funeral outside Bozeman. Even then, they barely spoke. Two brothers standing beside the same grave like strangers waiting for different buses. The deputy cleared his throat softly. There's also the matter of the property. Mason blinked once. What property? Cabin outside Blue Mountain Road. The deed transferred to you automatically under probate review. Papers shuffled again. Look, I probably shouldn't say this over the phone, but he hesitated. There's something strange about that cabin. Mason finally looked down at the phone. What kind of strange? Another pause. When you come out there, you'll see. The line went quiet except for static. Mason waited. The deputy spoke again, lower this time. Your brother spent the last few years digging around that place. Folks out there thought he'd lost it. Atlas lifted his head again at the sound of Mason's breathing changing. Not faster, just shallower. Mason rubbed two fingers against his eyebrow, fighting the pressure building behind his eyes. Not now. The deputy gave directions to the county office near West Broadway for paperwork pickup. Mason listened automatically, memorizing turns without needing to write them down. Training again, always training. When the call ended, silence filled the Suburban immediately. Atlas turned around carefully in the seat and pressed his nose against Mason's forearm. Mason stared ahead another full minute before speaking. Owen's dead. The dog's ears twitched at the name. Outside, snow clouds drifted low above the dark hills beyond Missoula. Winter hadn't fully arrived yet, but the mountains already carried white streaks across their upper ridges. Mason reached forward and started the engine. The Suburban coughed twice before turning over. Gas gauge just under a quarter tank. Check engine light still on. The dashboard clock read 11:02 p.m. He pulled slowly out of the parking space and headed toward the edge of the lot where overnight campers usually parked unnoticed between RVs and delivery trucks. Atlas climbed into the passenger seat and stayed alert the entire time. No barking, just watching. Mason parked near the far corner beneath a burned-out light pole. The engine idled roughly. He shut it off and sat there listening to the ticking sound from the cooling hood. 3 months. 3 months dead in the woods. He tried imagining Owen alone out there near Blackfoot River, with winter closing in around him. Couldn't do it. His mind kept sliding sideways into Afghanistan instead. Dust. Rotor wash. The smell of overheated metal under body armor. A village compound near Sangin, where the walls looked soft until bullets started punching through them. Mason squeezed his eyes shut. Not now. Atlas pushed his head harder beneath Mason's hand, grounding him. The VA therapist in Helena used to call it interruption behavior. The dog sensed panic spikes before they fully surfaced. Useful skill. Saved Mason more than once. He scratched behind Atlas's ear slowly while staring out at the empty parking lot. A woman loaded groceries into a Subaru 3 rows away. A teenager skateboarded past the pharmacy entrance with headphones on. Normal life kept moving around him like water flowing around a rock in a river. Nobody noticed the man sleeping inside the old SUV near the edge of the lot. Nobody noticed the dog watching everything. Mason reached toward the glove box and pulled out an old folded photograph. The edges were cracked from years inside his wallet. 2 boys standing beside a fishing boat near Flathead Lake sometime in the late 80s. Owen looked 17 maybe. Thin, serious. One hand resting awkwardly on Mason's shoulder like he wasn't used to touching people even then. Mason stared at the photo for a long time, then folded it again. Atlas suddenly lifted his head toward the windshield. Another sound outside. Metal. Close this time. Mason's posture changed instantly. Atlas growled low again. A shadow moved past the rear window. Mason clicked the flashlight off safety mode and waited. Boot steps approached slowly across gravel. 1 step pause, another. Atlas stood fully now. The figure finally appeared beside the driver's side window. An older man in a Walmart maintenance jacket, carrying a trash grabber and cigarette pack. Not a threat. The employee glanced inside the vehicle, noticed Atlas immediately. then lifted both hands slightly. "Easy, buddy." Atlas didn't bark. The man looked at Mason through the glass. "You staying overnight?" Mason rolled the window down halfway. Cold air rushed in immediately. "Just till morning." The worker nodded toward Atlas. "Dog's beautiful." Mason glanced at the shepherd. He earned his retirement. The worker smiled faintly, though his eyes lingered on Mason's boots and the pile of blankets in the back seat a second too long. Recognition. Not judgment exactly, just understanding. "You military?" Mason nodded once. The man tapped 2 fingers against the window frame. "My brother was Fallujah." Then he walked away without another word. Mason rolled the window back up slowly. Atlas finally relaxed enough to sit again. Outside, snow began falling lightly over the parking lot, thin flakes, barely visible beneath the flickering lights. Mason leaned his head back against the seat. He should felt something stronger by now. Grief, maybe. Anger. But exhaustion sat heavier than either. 14 months surviving one day at a time had worn emotions down into simpler things. Hunger, noise, weather, movement, sleep. Still, Owen was gone. And somehow that cabin belonged to him now. He looked toward Atlas. "We head up there in the morning." Atlas blinked slowly. Mason reached over and shut off the dome light. Darkness filled the vehicle again, except for distant parking lot glow, filtering through the windows. A few minutes later, Atlas finally laid his head across Mason's knee. But he never fully fell asleep. Neither did Mason. At 1:18 a.m., he woke again, because snowplow chains scraping asphalt sounded too much like tracked vehicles crossing gravel roads outside Kandahar. At 2:41 a.m., Atlas jerked upright, growling toward nothing visible beyond the windshield. Mason's heart slammed hard enough to leave his hands shaking afterward. At 3:09 a.m., he checked the mirrors 3 separate times because he was suddenly certain someone had parked beside them without headlights. Nobody had. By 4:30 a.m., fresh snow covered most of the parking lot. Mason sat awake watching flakes drift beneath the dim lights while Atlas monitored the darkness beside him. Neither of them noticed dawn arriving, only the cold getting deeper. And somewhere beyond Missoula, past the frozen roads climbing toward Blue Mountain, a dead man's cabin waited quietly in the trees. By 6:18 a.m., Mason was driving west through the gray light of early morning, with Atlas sitting rigid in the passenger seat. Snow clung to the edges of Reserve Street in dirty, frozen piles left behind by plows during the night. Gas stations flickered awake, one by one, along Brooks Street, while exhausted workers shuffled through parking lots, carrying paper cups of coffee and cigarette packs tucked into jacket sleeves. Missoula looked half asleep. Mason barely noticed any of it. The heater inside the Suburban only worked when the engine stayed above 40 miles an hour. Every red light brought another wave of cold into the cab. Atlas kept staring forward, nose twitching occasionally toward the cracked passenger side window, where thin threads of icy air slipped through worn rubber seals. Mason stopped at the town pump near Highway 93 South at exactly 6:31 a.m., $27.14. That was all the gas he could afford. The cashier behind the counter wore a University of Montana hoodie, 2 sizes too large and dark circles under her eyes. She glanced once at Atlas waiting inside the Suburban, then at Mason's weathered face. "Roads are bad past Lolo," she said while handing back his card. "Black ice near Blue Mountain turns." Mason nodded once. "Appreciate it." She hesitated. "Your dog okay riding in this weather?" Mason looked through the window toward Atlas. "He's had worse." The cashier didn't ask anything after that. Most people didn't. Outside, the wind carried the smell of gasoline, wet pavement, and pine drifting down from the hills beyond town. Mason climbed back into the driver's seat, flexing his stiff fingers once before gripping the wheel. Atlas leaned closer immediately, resting his chin near Mason's arm for half a second, checking him. Mason scratched behind the dog's ear without looking away from the road. The farther south they drove, the emptier the world became. Strip malls disappeared first, then neighborhoods. Soon, only scattered ranch fences and frozen fields stretched alongside the highway, while dark pine forests thickened against the mountain slopes ahead. Snow covered most of the roadside now. Thin fog drifted low over sections of the Blackfoot River corridor, where the water still moved beneath sheets of ice. At 7:12 a.m., Mason passed the old Clearwater Junction turnoff. Atlas stood up suddenly, not barking. Alert, Mason noticed it immediately. "What is it?" The dog stared toward the tree line west of the road. Mason slowed slightly, scanning automatically. Movement near the forest edge. A pickup truck, dark green Ford, older model, parked crooked beside a service road, half buried in snow. No lights, no movement inside. Maybe abandoned, maybe not. Atlas kept watching it until the vehicle disappeared behind them. Mason checked the rearview mirror twice afterward anyway. Some reflexes never stopped working. Blue Mountain Road narrowed sharply after mile marker 14. The pavement became rougher there, twisting upward through heavy pine forest broken occasionally by stretches of exposed rock and old logging clear-cuts. Snow drifted sideways across the road in pale ribbons whenever the wind picked up. The cabin sat another 6 miles beyond that, isolated. Exactly the kind of place a man chose when he no longer wanted visitors. Mason finally saw it at 7:58 a.m. The structure stood halfway up a wooded slope, overlooking a narrow frozen creek bed hidden beneath snow-covered brush. Time and weather had beaten the cabin nearly flat. One corner leaned several inches lower than the rest of the building. The porch roof sagged badly beneath old storm-damaged, patched with mismatched metal sheets. No smoke, no tracks, no sign anyone had lived there recently. Mason killed the engine but didn't get out immediately. Atlas already had. The dog pushed through the passenger door the second it opened, and dropped straight into the snow with practiced balance despite his age. 8 years old now, gray beginning around the muzzle. Still sharp, still working. Atlas ignored the cabin completely. Instead, he moved toward the rear of the property, nose low, weaving slowly through knee-high snowdrifts behind the structure. Mason watched him for a second before grabbing his backpack from the rear seat inside. Flashlight, canteen, fixed blade, knife, thermal Glock 19, wrapped inside an old t-shirt travel light. Stay mobile. Another habit from another country. Snow crunched sharply beneath his boots as he approached the porch. The wood groaned under his weight immediately. One more winter and this place would probably collapse on its own. A faded Montana plate hung crooked beside the doorframe. Read 114 scratched into rusted metal beneath layers of weather and pine sap. Mason pushed the front door open carefully. The smell hit first. Dust, old wood, rust, cold ash, and underneath all of it, earth. The inside looked smaller than he expected. One main room, tiny kitchen area, iron stove near the wall, a cot pushed beneath a narrow window covered partly by a wool blanket nailed into place against drafts. But something felt off immediately. Not abandoned exactly. Paused. Mason stepped farther inside slowly, eyes moving automatically corner to corner. Clear left, clear right, window line, secondary exit, ceiling condition. He caught himself doing it halfway through the room. Afghanistan again. Atlas barked once outside. Sharp. Mason turned immediately toward the back door. The dog stood near a cluster of dead brush behind the cabin, pawing aggressively at the snow-covered ground beside a rusted metal pipe, sticking barely 2 inches above the surface. What do you find? Atlas kept digging. Snow sprayed backward beneath powerful front paws until frozen dirt appeared underneath. Mason crouched beside him. The pipe wasn't random. 3-inch steel ventilation tubing. Old but maintained. Snow had been cleared around the base recently enough that rust lines remained visible above the frozen dirt, not natural. Mason looked around more carefully now. That's when he noticed the ground. Uneven patches beneath the snow. long, shallow depressions. Mounds hidden under ice where earth had clearly been disturbed. Over and over through the years. Digging. A lot of digging. Atlas moved farther toward the trees and sniffed along another section of frozen ground. Mason followed slowly until he spotted faint tire tracks cutting behind the cabin toward the woods. Old tracks, but not ancient. The left tread pattern still visible where wind hadn't buried it completely. Mason crouched lower, studying them. Truck tires, wide axle, possibly heavy load weight from how deep the rear tracks sat in the frozen mud beneath snow layers. The tracks vanished deeper into the trees. Atlas growled softly toward the forest. Mason's hand drifted unconsciously toward the pistol beneath his jacket. The woods stayed silent. Then a voice behind him nearly made Atlas spin. "You must be Mason." Mason turned instantly. Woman, late 30s maybe. Brown insulated coat, dark knit cap pulled low over loose blonde hair. Holding a cardboard drink tray from Liquid Planet Coffee and a paper grocery bag against one hip. Not close enough to be a threat. Still too close for comfort. Atlas stepped between her and Mason automatically. The woman stopped immediately. "Smart. It's okay," she said quietly, eyes staying on the dog instead of Mason. "I knew your brother." Mason studied her for several long seconds before answering. "How'd you get up here?" "Road wasn't blocked yet." She nodded toward the cabin. "Sheriff's office said you'd probably come this morning." Atlas continued watching her carefully. The woman lowered the grocery bag slowly into the snow. "I brought food." Mason glanced at the bag but didn't move. "Why?" A little cloud of breath drifted from her mouth as the wind shifted through the trees. "Because Owen never asked anybody for help." She paused. "And because winter's early this year." Atlas sniffed the air once, then looked back toward Mason. Not aggressive anymore. "Interesting." The woman finally extended one gloved hand slightly. "Claire Bennett." Mason shook it once. Her fingers felt freezing cold. "You work with the sheriff?" Claire shook her head. "St. Patrick Hospital." She pointed back toward the road. "Night shift. Oncology wing." Mason nodded slowly. Hospital smell still clung faintly to her coat beneath the coffee and winter air. Antiseptic, laundry detergent, rubber gloves. Atlas moved closer to the grocery bag and sniffed cautiously. Claire gave the dog a small smile. "Owen talked about him sometimes." Mason looked up sharply. "He did?" "Not much." She hesitated. "Mostly stories from Afghanistan," said the dog. "Once found an IED. Your convoy rolled over it." Mason looked toward Atlas. The shepherd had lowered himself into the snow beside the bag now, watching the woods again instead of Claire. "He remembers things," Mason said quietly. Claire's expression changed slightly at that. Not pity. Recognition, maybe. Wind rattled through the trees overhead. Somewhere farther uphill, something metallic clanged softly against something else. Mason's eyes snapped instantly toward the sound. Claire noticed. "Your brother rigged half this property with junk metal alarms the last couple years," she said. "Said people kept trespassing. Did they?" Another pause. Claire looked toward the cabin before answering. "Your brother stopped trusting people near the end." The words settled heavily in the cold air between them. Mason glanced back toward the cabin again. Broken roof, crooked porch, vent pipe hidden beneath snow, digging everywhere, and now alarms in the woods. Atlas suddenly stood again and walked toward the rear wall of the cabin. He sniffed along the foundation slowly, then pressed his nose against the wooden siding near the kitchen area. Mason followed him. Deep claw scratches marked the lower boards there. Not animal scratches, tool marks, pry damage maybe. Someone had tried forcing their way through the wall at some point. Claire saw Mason staring at them. "Owen called the sheriff twice last winter," she said quietly. "Said somebody kept coming onto the property at night." "What they want," he never said. Mason touched the damaged wood carefully. Fresh enough, the edges still looked pale beneath the weather. Not old. Atlas suddenly froze. Every muscle locked tight. Then he turned slowly toward the cabin door itself. Mason noticed the change instantly. The dog's ears lifted, tail stiff, nostrils flaring. He wasn't smelling Claire anymore. He was smelling something inside the cabin, something beneath it. Atlas moved forward carefully now, entering the cabin without waiting for command. Mason followed him. Inside, the dog crossed directly through the main room toward the small kitchen area near the back wall. Snow melted slowly from his paws onto warped floorboards, while his nose tracked across the ground in tight circles. Then he stopped, one exact spot beside the old stove. Atlas scratched once against the floorboards, hard. The sound echoed strangely through the cabin. Not solid wood. Hollow. Mason looked down slowly. Atlas scratched again. And this time, the dog let out a low, uneasy whine deep in his throat, like he'd found something buried that wasn't supposed to be there. Mason crouched slowly beside the old stove. The warped floorboards beneath Atlas's paws looked no different from the rest of the cabin at first glance. Same faded pine. Same nail heads pushed halfway out from years of winter expansion and spring thaw. But when Mason pressed one gloved hand against the wood, he felt it immediately. A faint vibration, not movement, space. Atlas scratched again. Harder this time. The sound underneath came back hollow and deep, nothing like the solid earth foundation most cabins in Montana sat on. It echoed up through the boards with a dull wooden thump that seemed to continue a second too long. Claire heard it too. Her eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't there before. Mason looked up at her. "You've been inside recently?" "About 6 months ago." She stayed near the doorway, arms folded against the cold. "Owen asked me to bring antibiotics after he cut his arm with a saw. Did you see this spot?" She shook her head slowly. "No." Atlas barked once. Short, sharp. Mason grabbed the rusted fireplace poker, leaning beside the stove, and shoved the tip between two floorboards. The wood resisted, at first swollen from moisture and years of neglect. Then one nail finally snapped free with a loud crack that made Atlas flinch backward. Mason froze instantly. The sound had bounced through the cabin too much, like a gunshot inside concrete walls. Helmand Province flashed through his head before he could stop it. Dust, heat, a metal door exploding inward. Someone yelling contact left over the radio. Mason's breathing shortened. Atlas immediately pressed against his leg, grounding. Mason closed his eyes once and forced the memory back down where it belonged. Not here, not now. Claire watched him carefully but said nothing. Smart again. Most people tried filling silence because it made them nervous. Claire seemed to understand silence was sometimes the only thing holding somebody together. Mason pried harder against the floorboard. Another nail squealed loose. Cold air drifted upward through the crack immediately. No, not cold. Cool, different. The air rising from below carried a dry, earthy smell mixed faintly with machine oil and old wood smoke. It reminded Mason of underground storage tunnels he'd once searched near Kandahar during a winter operation in 2011. Hidden spaces always had their own smell. Atlas backed away just enough to let Mason work, but never stopped staring at the widening gap. The second board came free easier, then the third. Claire stepped closer now despite herself. What the hell? The opening beneath the floor was barely 2 feet wide at first, but it was enough. Enough to see darkness below. Enough to see metal. Mason brushed loose dust aside with one hand and leaned closer. A ladder. Steel-rung ladder bolted directly into reinforced beams disappearing downward beneath the cabin. Atlas whimpered low again. Mason reached immediately for the flashlight clipped inside his jacket pocket. His thumb hit the switch automatically while his body shifted sideways, without conscious thought, placing the stove between himself and the opening. Angle control, field of fire, cover. Training took over before logic did. Claire noticed the change instantly. Mason, he lifted one hand slightly, quiet. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness below in a tight white cone. Dust drifted slowly through the air like smoke particles. 10 feet down, maybe. Hard to tell exactly. The beam caught wood supports first, fresh compared to the cabin above, then dirt walls, then something farther back. A tunnel. Mason stared at it without moving. Not a cellar, not random digging. A real, reinforced passage leading beneath the mountain itself. Atlas leaned forward carefully beside him, nose twitching toward the darkness below. The dog didn't bark now. He listened. Mason listened too. Nothing. No movement. No shifting dirt. Just stillness. At 8:41 a.m., snow began falling harder outside the cabin. The sound landed softly against the roof while Mason widened the opening enough to fit through safely. Claire handed him an old canvas dropcloth from beside the cot to kneel on while he worked. "Your brother seriously built this under the cabin?" Mason kept pulling boards loose. "Looks like it." Claire shook her head slowly, almost to herself. "People in town said he was digging survival bunkers because the government was spying on him." Mason glanced sideways at her. "You believe that?" "No." She paused. But Owen stopped correcting people after a while. The opening finally stretched wide enough for Mason to lower himself through. Atlas moved closer immediately. Mason looked down into the darkness again. The flashlight beam reached farther now, enough to reveal timber reinforcement, spaced evenly, every 4 feet or so. Professional spacing, not amateur work. Someone had planned this carefully. Mason stood and removed his jacket slowly. Then the Glock from beneath it. Claire noticed immediately. "You expecting someone down there? Always assume occupied until cleared." The words came out flat and automatic. He checked the magazine once, chambered status once more, then tucked the pistol low behind his waistband beneath the thermal shirt. Atlas stood ready beside the opening. Mason pointed downward. Easy. The shepherd descended first without hesitation. Careful steps. Controlled weight. Military dogs learned ladders differently than pets did. Atlas moved rung to rung slowly until his paws touched dirt below. Then he stopped and looked back upward immediately. Waiting, Mason followed. The ladder groaned once beneath his weight but held solid. Cool air wrapped around him as he descended into the darkness beneath the cabin. By the time his boots touched the dirt floor below, outside sounds had nearly vanished completely. No wind, no creaking trees, just underground silence. The flashlight beam swept carefully left to right. The tunnel stretched forward roughly 20 feet before curving out of sight deeper beneath the hillside. Reinforced wooden supports lined both walls exactly like old mining braces. Metal brackets anchored several sections into stone. Not sloppy work, engineered. Atlas moved ahead slowly, nails clicking softly against compact dirt, while he sniffed every beam base and corner. Mason crouched beside one support post and ran his fingers across the wood grain. Douglas fir, pressure-treated, newer than the cabin above by years. He found pencil markings near the base, 11, 14, 21 measurements, load calculations. Whoever built this knew structural engineering. "Owen," Mason muttered quietly. Claire's voice drifted from above. "You okay down there?" Mason looked upward toward the square of gray light above them. Yeah, a lie. His pulse still hammered too hard beneath the silence underground. The tunnel air felt too much like compounds overseas, too enclosed, too quiet before contact. Atlas suddenly stopped moving. Every muscle tightened. Mason lifted the flashlight immediately. The dog stood near the tunnel curve, staring into darkness farther ahead. No growling, listening again. Mason drew the pistol halfway this time without fully realizing it. "Atlas!" The shepherd glanced back once but stayed alert. Mason moved forward carefully now, placing each step deliberately to avoid loose debris. His flashlight beam shook once before he steadied it with both hands. The tunnel widened suddenly around the bend. Mason stopped cold. The underground chamber beyond was far larger than he expected, at least 15 feet across. Maybe more. The ceiling arched overhead with reinforced timber, supports bolted into sections of exposed rock. Shelving units lined one wall, holding sealed containers, old tools, propane canisters, and stacked water jugs covered in dust. An iron stove sat near the far corner connected to a vent pipe disappearing upward into darkness, and beside it, a table. Still set up exactly as Owen must have left it. Notebook, lantern, coffee mug, reading glasses folded neatly beside several hand-drawn maps spread across the wood surface, like the owner had simply stepped outside for a minute. Mason lowered the flashlight slowly. Claire climbed down behind him moments later and stopped halfway off the ladder. Oh my God. Atlas walked the perimeter once before finally relaxing slightly near the table. Mason approached it carefully. The notebook cover was black leather, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. A faded write in the lane below barely remained visible near the corner. Mason opened it slowly. The handwriting inside belonged to Owen immediately. Precise, small, measured, page after page filled with diagrams, tunnel airflow calculations, soil temperature records, wind direction charts dated over multiple winters. There were sketches of the mountain slope above them, cross-sections of underground chambers, notes about insulation density and thermal retention. Mason flipped another page, another. Then he stopped. One sentence had been underlined twice in black ink. If winter gets worse, this valley won't survive above ground. The words sat there heavy against the paper. Claire stepped closer beside him. What does that mean? Mason kept reading silently. Temperature graphs, emergency shelter notes, wildfire smoke patterns from the previous summer, power outage records for Missoula County. And farther down one page, Earth holds stable temp between 52 degrees 55 Fahrenheit year-round below frost line. Another line underneath, wooden homes bleed heat. Soil does not. Atlas suddenly moved away from the table toward the far wall, sniffing again. Mason watched him closely now. The dog stopped beside another section of reinforced dirt near the back of the chamber. Snowmelt dripped slowly through cracks in the ceiling somewhere distant, tapping softly against metal in irregular intervals. Atlas pawed once at the wall. Dirt crumbled slightly. Behind it, something solid knocked back. Not stone, wood. Mason stepped closer. The flashlight beam caught fresh scrape marks near the edge of the wall support, newer than everything else underground. Recent, very recent. Then Atlas growled, low, focused not at the wall, at something beyond it. Atlas stood rigid near the rear support beam, head low, ears angled toward the packed dirt, like he could hear movement traveling through the mountain itself. Mason killed the flashlight for 1 second. Complete darkness swallowed the chamber instantly. He listened, nothing. Then, a faint metallic tap somewhere deeper underground, small, distant. Atlas growled again. Mason switched the light back on and moved closer to the wall, while Claire stayed near the table, gripping Owen's lantern with both hands. "You hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah." Mason crouched beside the scrape marks Atlas had found. Dirt had been disturbed recently enough that loose soil still crumbled when he touched it. The wooden reinforcement beam beside it carried fresh scratches too, almost waist-high. Tool marks again. Not Owen's old work, recent. Atlas sniffed the ground once more and suddenly sneezed hard, backing away from the wall with a sharp shake of his head. Gun oil. Mason recognized the smell immediately now that the dog reacted to it. Faint, but there. His hand drifted toward the Glock beneath his jacket again. Claire noticed. "You think somebody's been down here?" Mason didn't answer right away. Instead, he swept the flashlight beam slowly across the chamber again. His eyes stopped on details he'd missed earlier. A folding chair near the stove. Coffee grounds still inside a tin container. Half-used box of .308 rounds stacked neatly beside the shelves. And near the far wall, a digital thermometer mounted beside a vent pipe, 54.3 Fahrenheit, stable. Even underground, Owen had been tracking temperature constantly. Mason stepped back toward the table and opened the notebook again. Atlas followed immediately this time, staying pressed close enough that his shoulder brushed Mason's knee every few seconds, grounding him again. Outside, wind moaned faintly through the vent system overhead. Snow continued falling above the mountain, but down here the air barely changed at all. Mason flipped through page after page. Dates, measurements, engineering calculations. The deeper he read, the stranger the notebook became. Owen had documented everything. September, frost depths, airflow pressure changes, wildfire smoke density from the summer before, electrical outage maps for western Montana counties, even propane price increases. One page carried a handwritten note across the top corner. Missoula shelter failure, risk if grid goes down longer than 9 days in sub-zero conditions. Claire read over his shoulder quietly. He really thought something bad was coming. Mason turned another page. A sketch of underground chambers connected through ventilation shafts carved into hillside rock. Cross-sections showed heat retention zones beneath frost depth lines. And beneath all of it, one sentence written darker than the others. People build homes like they're at war with winter. Mason stopped reading there, because suddenly he remembered something. Owen standing beside their father's garage in Bozeman sometime around 1994. Snowstorm outside. Owen talking about insulation, while everyone else watched football inside. "You don't beat cold by making more heat," Owen had said back then. "You beat it by keeping the heat from escaping." Their father laughed at him for 20 straight minutes afterward. Mason hadn't thought about that day in years. Atlas nudged his arm. Mason blinked and looked down again at the notebook. Another page. Another underlined sentence. "The Earth already knows how to survive winter." Claire crossed her arms tighter. "You know what people in town called him?" Mason kept reading. "Bunker nut," she said quietly. "Doomsday Reed. Crazy Owen." The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Mason's grip before steadying again. Claire watched him carefully, but he wasn't crazy. Mason finally looked up. "How long did you know him?" "A couple years." She shrugged faintly. "Mostly after chemo treatments started." That got his attention immediately. "Chemo?" Claire nodded slowly. "Owen had stage 3 lymphoma." Silence settled heavily underground. Even Atlas stopped moving. Mason stared at her. "No one told me." "He didn't want anybody telling you." Claire walked toward the shelves and brushed dust from one of the storage bins with her glove. "He said you already carried enough ghosts around." Mason looked away immediately after that. Toward the tunnel. Toward the darkness. Anywhere else. Claire pretended not to notice. Another smart decision. At 10:16 a.m., Mason climbed back up into the cabin alone, while Claire organized supplies below. Atlas followed close behind him. The snowfall had thickened into dense gray curtains, drifting sideways through the trees. Wind pushed hard against the crooked cabin walls now, making the entire structure creak softly. Mason stepped outside and scanned the property automatically. Tree line, truck tracks, slope angles, cover positions. The mountain felt different now, not abandoned, observed. Atlas wandered toward the rear clearing again, nose low through the snow. Mason followed him past the rusted vent pipe until they reached the old tire tracks, disappearing into the woods. Fresh snow had partly buried them already. Still visible, though. Mason crouched low and brushed loose powder aside with one glove. Goodyear Wrangler tread pattern. Large truck, heavy rear weight. Not Owen's old Tacoma. Atlas suddenly froze again, facing uphill toward the pines. Mason followed his line of sight. Nothing visible, but the woods had gone quiet. No birds, no branch movement. No sound except wind. The same kind of silence patrols learned to notice before contact. Mason straightened slowly. "Let's move." Atlas stayed alert all the way back to the cabin. Inside, Mason barred the front door with a warped 2x4 he found beside the stove. Then he checked every window twice, not because he believed someone was coming, because his body wouldn't let him do otherwise. By noon, the temperature outside had dropped another 6 degrees. Claire heated canned soup on the underground stove, while Mason sat at Owen's table reading more of the notebooks. Atlas finally relaxed enough to lie beside the chair, though one ear remained tilted toward the tunnel entrance the entire time. Mason reached a section near the middle of the notebook marked Helmand. His fingers stopped moving. Several pages contained notes comparing Afghan underground compounds to Montana soil temperatures. Owen had apparently researched military tunnel systems for years. One line read, "Taliban understood thermal stability better than most Americans." Another, "You don't survive extremes above ground." Mason leaned back slowly in the chair. Claire set a bowl beside him. "Eat something." He barely touched it. The smell of heated canned beef stew mixed strangely with the dirt and machine oil underground. It reminded him too much of forward operating bases overseas. Small enclosed rooms. Too many men breathing recycled air. Everyone pretending exhaustion wasn't eating holes through them. Atlas rested his chin on Mason's boot. Mason finally took 2 bites. At 1:07 p.m., something metallic clattered outside above them. Loud enough this time to shake dirt from the ceiling beams. Mason was already moving before the sound fully registered. Chair backward, handgun drawn, flashlight up. Atlas exploded toward the ladder with a bark so violent it echoed through the chamber walls. Claire flinched hard against the shelves. "Stay down here." Mason climbed the ladder fast, boots hammering steel rungs while Atlas raced ahead into the cabin. The wind had blown the rear window partly open, that was all. One loose metal pan hanging outside the cabin had slammed against the wall repeatedly in the storm. But Mason's pulse kept racing anyway. Atlas paced the cabin perimeter twice before finally settling near the back door. Mason lowered the pistol slowly. His breathing stayed shallow another full minute. Then came the shaking, small at first, just on fingers. He shoved the gun back beneath his jacket and leaned both hands against the sink until the tremor passed. Atlas pressed against his leg immediately. Mason closed his eyes. Afghanistan again. Every loud metal sound became another breach charge in his head before logic caught up. Claire climbed up halfway through the episode and stopped when she saw him gripping the sink. Hard enough, his knuckles had gone pale. She stayed quiet. After a while, she walked to the stove and poured coffee into Owen's old mug instead. Black, no sugar. She handed it to him without speaking. Mason accepted it silently. The mug still carried a faded sticker from Lolo Peak Brewing Company near the handle. Owen's mug, Dead Brothers Coffee Cup, Dead Brothers Cabin, Dead Brothers Underground World. Mason stared out the frosted window while snow buried the mountainside outside inch by inch. "You know what the weird part is?" Claire said softly behind him. Mason didn't answer. He wasn't scared when he talked about storms. She looked toward the floor beneath them. He sounded prepared. The wind rattled the cabin walls again. Atlas lifted his head immediately, then lowered it once more. Mason drank the coffee slowly. Cold bitterness mixed with burnt grounds. Real coffee, not gas station sludge. The first decent cup he'd had in months. Claire finally sat across from him near the stove. "Owen tried presenting these shelter designs 2 years ago," she said quietly. County Emergency Board laughed him out of the room. Mason looked up. "What?" He showed them heating models, airflow systems, winter survival projections. She gave a faint, humorless smile. One guy asked if he planned on living with mole people underground. Atlas made a soft sound deep in his throat. Mason stared down toward the hidden chamber beneath the floorboards. The place wasn't random madness. Every beam underground lined up perfectly. Every vent positioned intentionally. Every measurement exact. Owen hadn't buried himself because he was crazy. He'd buried himself because he believed the world above ground was fragile. And maybe he was right. The thought settled into Mason slowly while snow thickened against the windows outside. Then Atlas stood abruptly, not alarmed this time, focused. The shepherd walked straight toward the far side of the underground chamber entrance again and stared at the floorboards beneath the kitchen counter. Mason followed him carefully. Atlas pawed once against the wood, then twice. Mason crouched lower and brushed dust aside near the cabinet base. Fresh dirt, very fresh. A cold draft slipped upward through a crack barely wider than a coin. Another hidden space, and this one definitely hadn't been in Owen's notebook. Mason slid the flashlight beam lower beneath the kitchen counter, while Atlas stood rigid beside him, nails scratching lightly across the warped floorboards. Cold air seeped upward through the crack in slow, uneven breaths, carrying the smell of damp dirt and something sharper underneath. Not mold, metal. Claire stepped closer behind him, wrapping her coat tighter against the draft. "You think Owen hid another room?" Mason rubbed his thumb slowly across the edge of the floor seam. "No." He looked up toward Atlas. "I think somebody else did." The dog's ears twitched immediately at Mason's tone. Outside, snow hammered harder against the cabin roof now. Wind shoved through cracks in the walls hard enough to make the hanging cookware rattle softly near the stove. The whole structure sounded tired, like it was remembering storms. Mason grabbed the pry bar again. The boards near the cabinet came loose easier than the others had. Too easy. The nails holding them down looked newer, shinier, less rusted than the rest of the cabin floor. Someone had replaced this section recently, very recently. At 2:18 p.m., the final plank lifted free. Atlas backed away instantly with a low, warning growl. The opening beneath wasn't another ladder. It was a crawl space, narrow, reinforced crudely with plywood sheets and scrap timber, instead of the carefully engineered supports Owen used below. Dirt had been dragged through recently enough that boot impressions still showed clearly beneath the flashlight beam. Size 11, maybe. Heavy tread. Mason lowered himself carefully to one knee and aimed the light deeper inside. The crawl space extended only 8 or 9 feet before widening into a small hidden pocket beneath the cabin foundation. Something sat back there covered beneath an old canvas tarp. Claire saw it too. "Mason!" He raised one hand again. "Quiet!" Atlas stayed near the opening but refused to enter. That bothered Mason more than anything else. Atlas had crawled through collapsed compounds overseas. Tight spaces usually didn't bother him. But this one did. Mason drew the Glock and crawled inside anyway. The plywood shifted beneath his elbows while cold dirt soaked through the knees of his jeans. The space smelled stale, human. Somebody had been here recently, enough that traces still lingered in the air. Sweat, gun oil, cigarette smoke, not Owen. Mason reached the tarp and pulled it back fast. Underneath sat 2 plastic fuel cans, canned food, thermal blankets, a bolt-action Remington rifle, and a locked metal ammo crate. He stared at it in silence. Someone had been using Owen's property. Maybe after his death. Maybe before. The flashlight caught another object shoved beside the ammo crate. Trail camera, broken clean through the middle. Mason picked it up carefully. The memory card slot had been ripped out deliberately. Not weather damage, not accidental. Destroyed. Atlas barked sharply from outside the crawl space. Warning bark. Mason backed out immediately. The second his boots hit the cabin floor, Atlas moved toward the front window, growling low into the storm outside. Claire whispered, "What is it?" Mason killed the flashlight beam and crossed toward the window carefully. Snow blurred most of the view beyond the glass, but movement flickered briefly near the tree line, downhill from the cabin. Dark shape, gone fast, could been branches, could been somebody watching the cabin. Atlas kept staring. Mason checked his watch. 2:31 p.m. too early for darkness. But the storm was thick enough now that the woods already looked like evening. Claire stepped beside him carefully. "You think someone's out there?" Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the snow near the truck tracks again through the glass. Then he saw it. Fresh movement, not snowfall. A shape crossing behind the pines, Human height gone again. Atlas lunged toward the door with a bark violent enough to shake dust from the rafters. Mason grabbed the dog's collar before he could hit the porch. No, Atlas strained hard against him anyway. The old combat instinct slid back into Mason's body like muscle memory waking from sleep. His breathing slowed, vision narrowed, every sound sharpened separately inside his head. Wind direction, tree movement, possible cover positions, distance from cabin to woods. He checked the pistol magazine once more automatically. Claire saw it happen. "You're really expecting trouble." "I'm expecting people." That sounded worse somehow. For the next 20 minutes, nobody spoke much. Mason sealed the hidden crawl space again temporarily with loose boards, while Atlas patrolled between the windows and door non-stop. Claire heated water for coffee, downstairs beneath the cabin, because the underground chamber stayed warmer than the freezing cabin above. Mason remained upstairs, watching. At 3:04 p.m., an engine sound drifted faintly through the storm. Truck, approaching slowly from the road below. Atlas growled instantly. Mason moved to the side window and saw headlights fighting through the snow. Dark green Ford pickup. Same truck from Highway 93. It rolled to a stop 30 yards from the cabin. The driver stayed inside another full 10 seconds before opening the door. Large man, mid-50s maybe, thick canvas coat, gray beard half covered in snow. Expensive boots too clean for somebody working outdoors all day. He noticed Atlas immediately standing behind the window. Then Mason. The man lifted one gloved hand casually and walked toward the porch like he belonged there. Mason opened the door before he reached it. The wind slammed snow sideways through the gap. The older man stopped at the bottom step. "You Mason Reed?" "Depends." The man smiled faintly at that. "Name's Wade Granger." Mason recognized it immediately. Granger Timber Holdings. Logging contracts all over western Montana. Money. Wade glanced past Mason toward the cabin interior. "Heard you finally came up to claim the place." Mason stayed blocking the doorway. Atlas stood beside him completely silent now, which was somehow more threatening than barking. Wade looked at the dog. "Beautiful shepherd. He bites." Wade smiled again. "Usually means they were trained right." Snow gathered on the man's shoulders while he talked. Expensive Carhartt gloves. Diesel smell clinging to the coat. Fresh scrape along the side of the truck, visible through the storm. Recent. Wade nodded toward the cabin floor. "Owen spent years digging himself into this mountain." He shrugged lightly. Never figured out why. Mason watched him carefully. "You two know each other?" "Canoe." Wade glanced toward the woods. "Tried buying this property from him 3 different times. And he refused every offer." Atlas stepped forward slightly. Wade noticed. His eyes flicked briefly toward the dog's scarred muzzle, then back toward Mason. "I'll be honest with you," Wade continued. "That cabin's finished. One bad winter collapse, and the whole thing slides halfway down the hill." Mason said nothing. Wade reached slowly into his coat pocket. Atlas growled instantly. The man stopped immediately. "Easy." He pulled out a folded paper instead. "I brought a copy of my last offer to Owen." Mason took it carefully. $87,500. Far more money than he'd seen in years. Enough to buy an apartment. A truck that actually ran. Medical treatment, maybe. Enough to disappear somewhere warmer. Wade watched his face carefully. "You're not gonna survive winter up here living in that thing," he said quietly. "Your brother didn't either." The wind howled hard against the porch roof. Mason folded the paper once. "Why'd you want the land so bad?" Wade hesitated just slightly. "Logging access." Lie. Mason knew it immediately, not because of the words, because Wade answered too fast. Atlas suddenly barked hard toward the truck parked below. Both men turned. A second shape moved briefly inside the pickup cab before ducking down out of sight. Mason's eyes narrowed instantly. "You bring somebody with you?" Wade looked annoyed now. "My nephew." "Why's he hiding?" "He's staying warm." Atlas kept staring toward the truck, hackles raised. Mason handed the offer paper back. Not selling. Wade's expression barely changed, but something colder settled behind his eyes. Look, he said quietly, your brother got obsessed with this mountain. Started seeing patterns everywhere. Storm cycles, power failures, end-of-the-world stuff. Mason crossed his arms slowly, and Wade glanced toward the cabin floorboards behind him, and he died chasing dirt, silence. Snow hissed sideways through the trees around them. Atlas stepped closer against Mason's leg. Wade sighed softly. You change your mind. Call me. He pulled a business card from his pocket and wedged it into the doorframe. Offer stands till Thanksgiving. Then he turned and walked back toward the truck. The second the engine started, Atlas barked again. Not fear. Recognition. Mason watched the pickup disappear downhill through the storm until the taillights vanished completely between the trees. Then he looked down at the business card. Granger Timber Holdings Reserve Street, Missoula Office Suite 204. There was mud smeared along one edge of the card. Dark red Montana clay. The exact same color stuck inside the hidden crawl space beneath the cabin. Claire appeared behind him quietly. You okay? Mason kept staring downhill. No, he shut the door hard against the storm. Atlas immediately returned to the hidden crawl space area and began sniffing the floorboards again. Mason crouched beside him slowly. The shepherd pressed his nose near the crack and growled low, then sneezed again. Gun oil, fresh dirt, and now diesel. Same smell from Wade's truck. Mason sat back on his heels. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Claire watched his face carefully. What is it? Mason looked toward the hidden compartment beneath the floor, then toward the snow-covered woods outside. Finally back toward Atlas. I think somebody's been using Owen's shelter. The wind slammed hard against the cabin walls again. Down below them, somewhere deeper inside the underground tunnels, a faint metallic sound echoed once through the earth. Like a door closing far underground. Atlas reacted first. The German shepherd spun toward the hidden chamber beneath the floorboards and barked once, sharp enough to cut through the storm, hammering the cabin roof above them. His body lowered immediately after, weight shifting forward, waiting for command. Mason already had the Glock in his hand. Claire stepped backward instinctively. What was that? Mason listened instead of answering. The cabin groaned softly in the wind. Snow hissed against the walls. Somewhere above the trees, branches cracked under ice buildup. Then, nothing. No second sound, no movement. But the silence below them felt different now, occupied. Mason looked toward Atlas. Down. The dog obeyed instantly, though every muscle stayed tight beneath his thick winter coat. Mason moved toward the underground ladder again while Claire grabbed Owen's lantern from the table. You're not going down there alone. Yes, I am. Mason. You hear another sound. You leave. Don't wait. Claire stared at him a second too long before nodding once. He disappeared below the floor without another word. The underground chamber felt warmer than before. Not hotter. Alive somehow. The airflow moving through Owen's ventilation system had strengthened as the storm worsened outside. Mason could feel it now against the side of his face. A slow current moving through the tunnels, almost like breathing. Atlas came down beside him quietly. No barking anymore, just listening. Mason swept the flashlight toward the rear tunnel, where the metallic sound had echoed from earlier. Dirt walls, timber supports, nothing visibly disturbed. But farther back, near the unfinished section Owen marked in the notebook, the air shifted differently, cooler. Mason crouched near the tunnel floor. Fresh drag marks. Somebody had moved equipment through here recently. Atlas sniffed along the dirt wall again and stopped near a narrow support beam. Mason hadn't paid much attention to before. The dog pawed once at the ground beside it. Mason aimed the flashlight lower. A steel hinge partially buried beneath packed soil. Hidden door. The realization hit him slowly. Owen built more than one entrance. Mason brushed dirt aside carefully with his gloves until the full outline appeared. Narrow steel hatch built directly into the tunnel wall and disguised beneath reinforced soil panels. Whoever designed it knew exactly what they were doing. Atlas sneezed again. That same sharp smell lingered around the hinge. Gun oil, diesel, cigarettes. Not old smells either. Recent enough the dog still reacted. Mason tested the hatch carefully, locked from the other side. He leaned closer and pressed one ear against the cold steel. Nothing, but the metal carried faint vibration through it. Wind, maybe. Or machinery, hard to tell underground. At 4:42 p.m., Claire climbed halfway down the ladder holding 2 steaming mugs. "You've been down here almost an hour." Mason stepped away from the hidden hatch. "What time is sunset?" 5:33. Not much daylight left. Claire handed him coffee carefully while eyeing the tunnel behind him. "You find anything?" "Another entrance." Her face tightened slightly. "To where?" "Don't know yet." Atlas moved toward her and finally relaxed enough to accept the piece of beef jerky she pulled from her coat pocket. First real calm moment all day. Mason noticed it immediately. Dogs always knew people better than humans did. Claire crouched beside Atlas while the shepherd chewed slowly. "He trusts me now," she said quietly. "No," Mason replied. "He trusts my reaction to you." Claire looked up at him. There it was again. That brief silence between strangers trying to decide how much truth belonged in the room. Mason looked away first, toward Owen's notebook. He opened it again while sipping the coffee. Real coffee this time. Bitter. Not gas station sludge poured from burnt machines at 2 in the morning. Claire sat near the stove. Snowmelt dripped slowly through the ventilation shaft somewhere overhead, while wind moaned faintly through the hidden tunnels. The underground room no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by the shape of Owen himself. Every beam, every calculation, every careful inch of dirt reinforced by hand. Mason turned another notebook page. This section carried less engineering and more observations. December 11th, temp outside, 14 Fahrenheit. Tunnel temp stable at 53 Fahrenheit. January 3rd, propane use reduced 68%. February 2nd, no ice buildup in lower chamber despite 3-day storm. Owen had been proving something, methodically, patiently. One line farther down caught Mason's eye. If the grid fails during a real polar event, most homes here become wooden freezers. Claire leaned forward slightly. He really believed this could save people. Mason stared at the page. He believed winter was changing. Outside, the storm answered him. A violent gust slammed against the cabin hard enough to shake dust from the tunnel ceiling. Atlas stood instantly, ears high. Mason's pulse jumped before logic caught up. Rotor wash. That's what the wind sounded like underground. For one fractured second, the tunnel became another Afghan compound in his head. Dark, tight, waiting for contact. His breathing shortened automatically. Atlas moved beside him immediately, pressing solid weight against Mason's leg. Grounding again. Mason rubbed one hand across the dog's neck until the shaking passed. Claire pretended not to notice this time. Better than sympathy. At 5:11 p.m., the power grid above them failed. The underground chamber noticed it, only because the faint glow from Claire's phone charger near the wall disappeared. Everything else stayed exactly the same. Stable air, steady warmth, small stove crackling softly. Mason looked upward instinctively toward the cabin ceiling. Town just lost power. Claire checked her phone. No signal now either. That storm hit earlier than forecast. Atlas wandered back toward the hidden steel hatch again. Watching it, Mason closed Owen's notebook slowly. He built this for a reason. Claire folded her arms tighter. "You think he knew storms were getting worse?" "No." Mason glanced around the chamber. "I think he knew people weren't ready when they did." Silence settled again. Then Atlas barked. Not warning this time. Excitement. The shepherd suddenly bounded toward the unfinished rear tunnel, tail high for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Mason followed him with the flashlight. The dog had stopped beside a section where loose dirt partially blocked another narrow passage. Air moved steadily through the crack now. Strong enough, the flashlight beam flickered slightly. Mason crouched lower. Cold airflow brushed his face. Natural airflow, not random. Claire approached behind him. "What is that?" Mason grabbed the shovel leaning near the wall. Ventilation route. He started clearing dirt carefully. Atlas helped immediately, digging with controlled bursts beside him until soil collapsed away, revealing a narrow upward tunnel reinforced with stacked stone. Fresh air rushed through harder now. The underground chamber changed instantly. The stale heaviness disappeared. The stove flame flickered brighter. Claire's eyes widened. "Oh my God." Mason aimed the flashlight upward through the shaft. Rough stone tunnel climbed sharply toward the mountainside above them. Owen's missing airflow system. Atlas barked happily once. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Mason almost smiled. Almost. He crawled upward carefully through the narrow stone passage, while Atlas followed close behind. The climb ended beneath a concealed rock pile, roughly 50 yards uphill from the cabin near the tree line. Snow blew sideways across the slope outside, but warm air drifted steadily upward from the tunnel beneath him. Breathing, the whole shelter was breathing now. Mason looked downhill toward the cabin through the storm. That's when he saw them. Tracks. Fresh boot prints crossing behind the tree line west of the property. Not Wade's old tracks from earlier. These were newer and moving toward the road fast. Atlas growled low beside him. Mason crouched immediately and studied the prints. 2 people, one heavier, one limping slightly from uneven stride depth. Both headed away from the cabin before the storm fully buried the trail. He followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared near the old logging road below. Then he noticed something half buried in the snow beside a pine stump. Cigarette pack. Marlboro Reds. Still dry enough inside the wrapper that it couldn't have sat there long. Mason picked it up carefully. One cigarette missing. The inside flap carried handwriting in black marker. WG. Atlas sniffed the pack once and growled harder. Same smell. Diesel. Gun oil. Wade Granger. The wind howled across the mountain hard enough now to sting exposed skin. Mason shoved the cigarette pack into his jacket pocket and looked back toward the hidden vent shaft beneath the rocks. Owen designed this exit carefully. Concealed. Protected from snow. Built for survival, not paranoia. Preparation. By the time Mason and Atlas climbed back underground, Claire had already reorganized half the chamber shelves and lit 2 more lanterns near the table. Warm amber light spread across the reinforced walls now, softening the harshness of the place, almost making it feel like home. Almost. Mason walked directly to Owen's notebook and flipped through pages again until he found another section marked passive thermal flow, diagrams, air circulation paths, emergency storm procedures. Then one final note, written sideways in the margin. If the main shaft opens, the whole system stays alive. Mason looked up slowly. He almost finished it. Claire nodded toward the tunnels. So finish it. The words hung there quietly between them while the storm deepened outside. Atlas settled beside the stove at last, exhausted but still alert enough that his ears twitched at every distant sound through the mountain. Mason stared around the underground chamber again. The reinforced beams, the stable temperature, the hidden ventilation routes, the emergency stores. Owen hadn't been digging himself a grave beneath this mountain. He'd been building a shelter, and somebody else knew exactly how valuable that shelter really was. Then somewhere above them in the cabin, floorboards creaked, heavy, slow, not caused by wind. Every muscle in Mason's body locked instantly. Atlas was already standing before the second creak came from above. One paw lifted slightly, head tilted toward the cabin floor overhead, listening. Claire froze beside the table, lantern light flickering across her face, while the underground chamber suddenly felt much smaller than before. Another step, heavy, measured, not random shifting wood. A person. Mason killed the nearest lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed half the chamber. Claire inhaled sharply. "Stay behind the support wall," Mason whispered. Atlas moved beside him without command. The old rhythm returned fast now. The one Mason spent years trying to bury after Afghanistan. Clear angles, control light, limit noise, funnel movement. Every instinct sharpening itself against possible danger. He checked the Glock once more. 15 rounds, 1 in chamber. The storm above masked some sound, but not enough. Whoever stood inside the cabin moved cautiously now. Floorboards creaked near the stove area. Then silence again. Mason pointed upward toward the ladder. Atlas waited. The dog's breathing stayed steady, focused. Military dogs learned patience before aggression. Atlas knew the difference between panic and threat. Mason climbed first, slow enough not to rattle the steel ladder. The hidden trapdoor stood barely 6 feet overhead now. Thin strips of cold light slipped through cracks round its edges, while snow hissed against the roof outside. Mason paused halfway up, listened. Nothing. Then a faint metallic click. Safety switch. Atlas heard it too. The shepherd's lips peeled back silently. Mason pushed the trapdoor upward 1 inch. Cold air rushed down immediately, carrying fresh snow and cigarette smoke into the tunnel below. Not old smoke. Fresh. Someone was inside the cabin. Mason opened the trapdoor another inch and angled the flashlight beam carefully through the gap without exposing himself. Empty stove. Table. Front door still barred. Then movement near the rear wall. Black winter boots. Mason saw only the lower legs at first. Whoever it was stood near the kitchen counter, staring toward the hidden floorboards. Searching. Mason lowered the trapdoor slowly. Claire waited below in near darkness. "What do you see?" "One person." Atlas stared upward hard enough his whole body trembled. Mason thought fast. Single intruder during a blizzard usually meant desperation. Unless the person already knew something valuable existed here. That changed everything. Another sound drifted through the floor. Overhead, the hidden crawl space boards being moved. The intruder found it. Mason closed his eyes once. Decision made. He looked toward Atlas. Guard. The shepherd immediately positioned himself beneath the ladder facing upward. Claire grabbed Mason's sleeve before he climbed again. "Mason, don't. He's looking for something. What if he's armed?" Mason gave her a tired look that somehow answered too much. Then he climbed. This time, faster. The trapdoor burst upward hard enough to slam against the cabin floor. Mason came through low with the Glock raised, while Atlas exploded behind him like a released spring. The intruder spun instantly near the crawlspace opening. Young man, mid-20s maybe, beanie cap, gray winter jacket. Bolt cutter still in one hand. His eyes widened the second Atlas charged. "Jesus Christ!" The shepherd slammed him backward before he reached the rifle, leaning near the wall. Not biting, pinning, controlled force. The man crashed into the kitchen counter hard enough to knock loose cans onto the floor. Mason leveled the pistol center mass immediately. "Don't move!" The man froze beneath Atlas's weight. Snow blew through cracks around the windows while the entire cabin shook under another violent gust outside. The intruder raised both hands slowly. Okay. Mason recognized him then. The younger guy from Wade Granger's truck. Atlas growled inches from the man's throat. Mason didn't lower the gun. "What are you doing here?" The man swallowed hard. "I wasn't stealing." "Wrong answer. You broke into the cabin during a blizzard." "I just needed." "What?" The young man glanced toward the hidden floorboards, then toward the tunnel beneath them. His silence answered enough already. Claire climbed out of the trapdoor behind Mason, lantern in hand. Recognition flashed across her face. "Ellie?" The young man looked away immediately. "You know him?" Mason asked. Claire nodded slowly. "Ely Granger, Wade's nephew." That made the room colder somehow. Atlas pressed harder against the man's chest with another warning growl. Eli winced. "Call your dog off." Mason ignored him. "What's under this mountain?" Eli stayed silent. Mason stepped closer. What was Owen hiding? Still silence. Then Atlas suddenly barked directly in the man's face. Eli cracked. "Okay." His voice broke harder than expected. "I don't know everything." Mason motioned with the pistol. "Start talking." At 6:18 p.m., while the blizzard swallowed Blue Mountain outside, Eli sat tied to one of Owen's kitchen chairs with extension cord wrapped around his wrists. Atlas never left his side. Not once. Claire heated canned chili downstairs while Mason questioned him beneath lantern light and rattling windows. Eli kept glancing toward the underground chamber. "You actually got it working." Mason stayed leaning against the wall near the stove. "Working enough." The younger man shook his head slowly. "My uncle said Owen was insane, and yet here you are breaking into his cabin during a polar storm." Eli looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, cracked lips from cold exposure. One bootlace replaced with electrical wire. Not a hardened criminal, just desperate. Finally, he exhaled heavily. "Wade thinks Owen found something under the mountain." Mason frowned slightly. "What kind of something? Rare earth deposits, maybe. Lithium, copper. I don't know." Eli rubbed his face against his shoulder. "Uncle Wade's been trying to buy land around this ridge for 3 years." Claire stared at him. "That's why Owen wouldn't sell." Eli nodded once. He thought Wade would strip the mountain. The wind outside howled hard enough now that snow pushed beneath the cabin door in thin white lines. Atlas looked toward it immediately. Mason watched Eli carefully. "So why break in tonight?" Eli laughed bitterly under his breath. "Because Missoula's shutting down." He nodded toward the storm outside. "Power grid's already failing west of Reserve Street. Half the county's gonna freeze if this keeps up." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. "You came here for shelter." Eli looked away. Not denial. Truth. Claire crossed her arms. "Your uncle know you're here?" "No." He hesitated. "But he knows about the tunnels." That changed the room again. Mason crouched near him slowly. "How much does Wade know?" Eli swallowed hard. "Enough to know Owen wasn't crazy." The lantern hissed softly beside them. Snow hammered the roof. Atlas stared at Eli another long second before finally backing away slightly. Judgment passed. For now. At 7:02 p.m., Mason finally cut Eli loose after taking the folding knife from inside his boot and unloading the .38 revolver hidden beneath his coat. Claire looked uncertain about it. "You trust him?" "No." "Then why untie him?" Mason glanced toward the storm outside. "Because nobody survives that alone tonight." Silence followed that. Even Eli seemed surprised. The cabin temperature dropped fast once darkness fully settled across the mountain. Ice formed along the inside corners of the windows despite the small stove burning constantly above ground. Down below, though, the underground chamber held steady. 54 degrees, exactly like Owen predicted. They moved downstairs before full nightfall. Eli stopped halfway down the ladder and stared openly at the underground shelter beneath him. Holy hell! The chamber glowed warm beneath lantern light now. Ventilation moved smoothly through the reopened shaft. Steam rose gently from the soup pot near the stove while Atlas circled the room once before finally settling near Mason's boots. Eli looked around slowly. He actually built this. Claire handed him a bowl quietly. "No," she said. "He engineered it." For a while nobody spoke much. The storm outside grew worse hour by hour. Phones lost signal completely by 8:11 p.m. Wind speeds hit nearly 60 miles per hour, according to the last weather alert Claire downloaded before service disappeared. National Weather Service called it the worst early polar system in western Montana in 11 years. Highway 12 already closed. Lolo Pass buried. Missoula emergency shelters overloaded. Mason sat beside Owen's notebook reading while the others ate quietly. Then another sound hit the mountain above them. Deep, distant, like thunder underground. The tunnel walls trembled slightly. Eli looked up sharply. What was that? Mason already knew. Avalanche. Somewhere higher on the ridge. Snowpack was collapsing now. The storm had turned deadly. Atlas lifted his head slowly from beside the stove, not alarmed, listening again. Mason looked around the underground chamber differently now. The reinforced beams, the steady warmth, the hidden ventilation. Owen hadn't built a bunker. He built a lifeboat beneath the mountain, and outside Montana was starting to drown in winter. Then every lantern in the chamber flickered at once. The airflow changed instantly. Atlas stood. Mason felt it too. The shelter had stopped breathing. The airflow that had moved steadily through the underground chamber all evening suddenly vanished. The lantern flames stopped flickering. The warmth shifted strangely against Mason's skin, like the room itself had gone still. Atlas stood immediately, ears high, body tense. The shepherd looked toward the rear ventilation tunnel and let out a low, uneasy sound deep in his chest. Claire noticed it too. The air changed. Mason was already moving. He grabbed Owen's flashlight from the table and crossed the chamber fast, while the distant storm rumbled through the mountain overhead. Eli followed halfway before Mason stopped him with one look. Stay here. What if the shaft collapsed? That's exactly why you stay here. Atlas followed Mason into the narrow rear tunnel without hesitation. The farther they climbed toward the ventilation shaft, the colder the air became. Dirt crumbled occasionally from the ceiling now. Fine dust drifted through the flashlight beam in pale clouds. Not good. Mason crouched beside the stone passage where the airflow should have been strongest. Nothing. No draft at all. Above them, somewhere beyond the concealed exit on the hillside, thousands of pounds of drifting snow had probably buried the vent opening completely. Atlas started pawing at the stone wall near the top of the shaft. Fast, urgent. Mason climbed higher carefully, boots slipping against the narrow rock passage while the tunnel groaned softly around them. Then the mountain shifted. A deep cracking sound rolled somewhere overhead. Atlas barked sharply. "Mason!" Claire shouted faintly from deeper below. Another tremor hit. Small avalanche. Snow pressure slammed against the buried ventilation shaft, hard enough that dirt rained down through the tunnel ceiling. Mason shoved himself backward instinctively, while Atlas lunged sideways against the wall. Then part of the tunnel collapsed. The section directly above Mason exploded inward with a violent burst of dirt, ice, and shattered stone. Atlas hit him hard. The shepherd slammed into Mason's chest just before the ceiling dropped, where his head had been a second earlier. Both of them crashed backward down the narrow slope. Rock struck Mason's shoulder hard enough to numb his arm instantly. The flashlight spun away into darkness. Claire screamed his name somewhere below. Then silence. Dust filled the tunnel thick enough to choke on. Mason coughed hard while Atlas barked frantically beside him. For one fractured second, the darkness became another collapsed compound overseas. Dirt, smoke, buried men yelling through broken concrete, somebody screaming for a medic over the radio. Mason's pulse exploded. Contact, collapse, entrapment. His breathing shortened instantly. Atlas pressed against him again, grounding him. Mason grabbed the dog's harness hard enough his knuckles cracked. Good boy. The words came rough. Claire's lantern beam finally appeared farther below them. Mason, I'm here. The dust slowly cleared enough to reveal the damage. Half the upper tunnel had collapsed completely. The ventilation shaft was blocked solid. Atlas limped slightly, now, left front paw. Mason noticed immediately. The shepherd tried putting weight on it once and pulled back fast, injured. Still standing, though. Always standing. Claire reached them breathless and crouched beside Mason. You okay? He nodded once automatically, even while blood dripped slowly from a cut above his eyebrow. Military reflex, again. Never answer honestly first. Claire ignored the lie. She grabbed his chin carefully and angled the lantern toward the wound. You're bleeding. It's nothing. Atlas whined softly. Claire looked down instantly. Oh no. The dog's paw had been sliced open by falling rock. Blood stained the dirt beneath him in small, dark drops. Atlas tried licking it immediately. Mason knelt beside him, despite the pain ripping through his shoulder. Easy. The shepherd held still while Mason examined the injury. Deep cut, not broken. Lucky. Claire pulled a first aid pouch from Owen's supply shelf near the tunnel entrance. Here. Mason cleaned the paw carefully while Atlas trembled, but never snapped once. Combat dogs learned early to trust pain coming from their handlers. Outside, the storm kept roaring above them unseen. The underground chamber already felt different without ventilation. Warmer in the wrong way. Heavy air slowly building near the ceiling. Mason wrapped the paw tightly. Atlas immediately tried standing again. Still working. Still guarding. Claire sat back against the dirt wall and exhaled shakily. What happens if we can't clear the shaft? Mason looked upward toward the collapse. Carbon buildup, eventually. Eli appeared at the tunnel entrance, now carrying another lantern. You mean we suffocate? Nobody answered him. That answer landed hard enough already. At 11:43 p.m., Masons climbed toward the collapsed section again, despite Claire arguing quietly behind him. You can barely lift your arm. I don't need both. You just got buried under part of a mountain. Mason kept climbing anyway. The tunnel had narrowed to barely shoulder width, where snow and dirt compacted against the blocked shaft. Every movement risked another collapse. Mason tested each section carefully before shifting his weight forward. Atlas tried following despite the injured paw. No. The shepherd ignored him immediately. Mason almost smiled despite himself. Stubborn animal. The dog crawled beside him anyway. Together they started digging. Not random. Controlled. Mason used the folding entrenchment tool from Owen's supplies while Atlas pulled loose dirt backward between them. Slow work. Dangerous work. But airflow mattered more than sleep now. Every few minutes Mason stopped to listen. Structural settling. Snow pressure. Wind direction above. Same instincts he used clearing compounds years ago overseas. Only now the enemy was winter itself. By 12:26 a.m., Mason's gloves were soaked through, and his shoulder barely moved right anymore. Blood from the cut above his eye kept dripping into one eyebrow. Atlas suddenly barked once, then started digging harder. Mason aimed the flashlight upward. Tiny movement, snow particles shifting. A crack of cold air brushed his face. There, a narrow opening. He attacked the blockage carefully now, while Atlas clawed beside him, despite the injured paw reopening and bleeding again. Then the tunnel breathed. Cold mountain air rushed downward suddenly hard enough to extinguish Mason's flashlight for half a second. Fresh oxygen swept through the shaft in a powerful natural current. The whole system came alive again. Far below them, Claire shouted something in relief. Atlas barked triumphantly once. Then the dog collapsed sideways. Mason caught him immediately. Atlas. The shepherd tried standing again, but couldn't put weight on the injured leg anymore. Too much blood loss. Mason lifted the dog carefully against his chest and carried him back down through the tunnel, while fresh airflow rushed steadily overhead once more. The underground chamber felt alive again by the time they returned. Lantern flames steadied. The heavy, stale feeling disappeared. Claire took one look at Atlas's bleeding paw and immediately cleared space beside the stove. Put him here. Mason laid the dog carefully onto folded blankets near the warmth. Atlas kept watching the tunnel entrance anyway. Even hurt, even exhausted, still guarding. Claire cleaned the wound properly this time using bottled saline from Owen's medical supplies. Mason sat beside the stove holding Atlas still while Eli fed small pieces of jerky to distract him. The shepherd finally relaxed slightly around 1:08 a.m. Outside, Montana disappeared entirely beneath whiteout conditions. No roads, no visibility, nothing except wind and snow. Claire checked the emergency weather radio Owen kept near the shelf. Wind chill -42 now. Eli stared at the reinforced dirt walls around them. If we stayed above ground, nobody finished that sentence, because they all knew. The cabin upstairs was already losing heat despite constant fire. Frost covered the windows completely now. Snow buried half the outer walls. But underground, stable, warm, breathable. Owen had been right, again. Mason sat beside Atlas while the dog slept finally for the first time in nearly 20 hours. One hand rested automatically against the shepherd's ribs, feeling each breath rise and fall. Grounding again. The storm outside faded into distant, muffled thunder beneath the earth. Claire watched him quietly across the stove. "You know what's weird?" Mason looked up. "You stopped scanning exits every 30 seconds. He almost denied it, then realized she was right. Down here, his shoulders had lowered slightly for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Not safe exactly, but safer. Mason stared around the chamber again. The reinforced beams, the careful airflow, the stable temperature. Owen designed all of this while people laughed at him. Eli broke the silence quietly from near the shelves. "My uncle knew this place worked." Mason looked toward him slowly. "What?" Eli rubbed both hands together near the stove. "Last winter, he swallowed hard. Wade sent me up here during a cold snap. Said he wanted to inspect the property." Claire frowned. "Owen let you inside?" "No." Eli shook his head. "But I saw smoke coming out of the stone vent shaft even during -20 weather." The room went quiet again. Eli stared into the fire. Wade realized Owen had built something valuable after that. Mason leaned back slowly against the dirt wall. Not lithium, not mining, not land. Shelter, that's what Wade wanted. A system, a design, something that could survive winters getting worse every year. Atlas lifted his head weakly from the blankets and looked toward Mason. The dog's eyes reflected lantern light softly in the underground warmth. Mason rubbed behind one ear carefully. "You saved my ass up there." Atlas thumped his tail once against the blanket. Then the emergency weather radio crackled suddenly through static. Multiple fatalities reported west of Missoula. The signal broke, returned again. Power infrastructure failure. Residents advised shelter in place. More static swallowed the transmission. Claire stared at the radio silently. Above them, people were freezing, generators failing, roads disappearing, homes losing heat. But beneath the mountain, Owen's shelter still held steady. The underground chamber glowed warm gold beneath lantern light, while snow buried the world above foot by foot. And for the first time since Owen died, Mason finally understood what his brother had really been building down here. Not a bunker, a future. The thought stayed with Mason long after the emergency radio fell silent again. The underground chamber glowed softly beneath lantern light while the storm buried western Montana above them. Snow pressed against the mountain in deep shifting waves. Now, every so often the earth groaned faintly around the shelter, reminding them how much weight sat overhead. Still, the temperature underground barely changed, 54 degrees. Steady. Atlas slept beside the stove with his bandaged paw stretched carefully away from the heat. Every few minutes, one ear twitched at sounds nobody else noticed. Instinct never really slept inside dogs like him, or men like Mason. At 3:17 a.m., Mason woke instantly. No alarm. No noise loud enough to explain it. Just that old combat sensation crawling up his spine again. Wrong. Something felt wrong. He sat upright on the cot beside the wall before fully understanding why. The underground chamber looked the same. Lantern burning low, Claire asleep beneath two blankets near the storage shelves. Eli slumped against the far support beam with Owen's notebook open across his chest. But Atlas was awake, watching the tunnel. Mason reached for the Glock automatically. Then he heard it, very faint. A distant mechanical vibration somewhere far above the mountain. Engine noise, multiple vehicles. Atlas stood slowly despite the injured paw. Mason checked his watch. 3:19 a.m. Nobody drove these roads willingly during a whiteout, unless something was very wrong, or somebody was searching. Mason climbed quietly toward the concealed ventilation shaft exit, while Atlas followed close behind. Snow blasted through the opening. The second Mason pushed aside the loose rocks covering the vent. The storm had weakened slightly. Not ended, but visibility stretched farther now, beneath pale moonlight, reflecting off endless snow, and down below near the buried logging road, flashing lights. Emergency vehicles. At least 3. Sheriff's department, maybe. 1 rescue snowcat. Mason stared down the slope through blowing snow. They were heading toward the cabin. Atlas barked once softly beside him. Mason understood immediately. The county thought he was dead. By 4:02 a.m., the first rescue team reached the property. Sheriff Daniel Harper stepped out of the lead snowcat, wearing a heavy orange survival jacket dusted white with snow. 2 volunteer SAR workers followed behind him, dragging emergency sleds through waist-deep drifts. The cabin barely remained visible anymore. Only the roofline and upper windows still showed above the snowpack. Harper removed his gloves long enough to check the property report again beneath flashlight glow. Mason Reed last known location. Blue Mountain Road cabin property vehicle located on-site, no confirmed contact in 72 hours. Claire's Subaru sat half-buried nearby. So did Eli's uncle's old truck tracks from days earlier. Everything pointed toward disaster. 1 SAR volunteer shook his head while staring at the collapsing roofline. No way anybody rode this storm out up here. Harper didn't answer. He kept studying the mountain. Something bothered him. The sheriff had seen enough winter fatalities around Missoula County to recognize the look of abandoned places. Dead properties carried stillness differently. This place didn't. Then he saw it. A thin ribbon of gray smoke drifting upward from somewhere higher on the ridge behind the cabin. Small, almost invisible against the storm clouds. But there, Harper narrowed his eyes. What the hell? The younger rescue worker followed his gaze. You seeing that? Before Harper answered, another sound rolled across the mountain. Dog bark, distant, then again, Atlas. The shepherd emerged first through blowing snow near the hidden ventilation shaft trail above the cabin. His limp showed immediately even through the drifting powder, but he kept moving downhill anyway, straight toward the rescue team. The younger SAR volunteer jumped slightly. Jesus. Atlas stopped 20 feet away, watching. Steam rolled from his muzzle in thick white bursts against the freezing air. Bandage visible around the injured paw, alive. Harper stared at the dog a long second, then toward the mountain above. No damn way. Atlas barked once more and turned uphill, waiting, like he expected them to follow. The sheriff looked at the others. Grab your packs. Snow crunched hard beneath their boots while they climbed behind the dog through knee-deep drifts. The storm had carved strange shapes across the ridge overnight. Entire pine branches lay snapped beneath avalanche debris higher on the slope. Atlas stopped beside the concealed stone vent shaft. The smoke rising from it looked almost unreal. Warm air drifted upward through the narrow opening into -40 wind chill conditions. The younger rescue worker crouched beside it. There's heat down there. Harper looked stunned. Then Atlas disappeared into the snow-covered rocks beside the shaft. The sheriff followed carefully and froze. Hidden beneath the ridge was a narrow stone tunnel descending into the mountain itself. Warm air rolled steadily upward through the darkness. Harper stared at it like he'd found another world buried under Montana. What in God's name? Atlas barked farther below, waiting again. At 4:37 a.m., Sheriff Harper climbed into Owen Reed's underground shelter for the first time. The temperature difference hit immediately. Not warm exactly, but stable, comfortable. After 3 days inside brutal sub-zero rescue conditions, the underground air felt almost impossible. Lantern light glowed across reinforced dirt walls. Steam rose from a kettle near the stove. Storage shelves lined one side of the chamber, stacked with food, water, and medical supplies. And near the table, Mason Reed sat calmly cleaning snow from a rifle bolt while Claire poured coffee into chipped mugs. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Harper just stared. Mason looked older underground somehow. Exhaustion carved deep beneath both eyes. Fresh cuts marked one side of his face. Dirt stained his sleeves. But he was alive. Atlas limped directly toward the stove and laid back down beside his blanket. Mission complete. Claire broke the silence first. You found us. The sheriff removed his gloves slowly. We thought you were dead. Mason nodded once toward the storm overhead. Fair assumption. The rescue volunteers climbed in behind Harper and stopped cold, too. One muttered quietly under his breath. No freaking way. Harper walked slowly through the chamber, touching support beams, feeling the steady airflow against his face, studying the reinforced ventilation system disappearing into the mountain. His expression shifted gradually from confusion to disbelief. You built this? Mason shook his head. My brother did. Claire handed Harper a mug of coffee. The sheriff accepted it absently while still staring around the shelter. How long have you been down here? Since the power failed. And this place stayed stable the whole storm. Mason glanced toward Owen's notebook lying open on the table. Pretty much. The younger SAR worker crouched beside the dirt wall near the stove. It's warmer underground than my apartment back in Missoula. Nobody laughed, because it was true. Harper finally noticed Eli sitting near the shelves. You're Wade Granger's nephew? Eli nodded awkwardly. The sheriff frowned. What are you doing here? Trying not to freeze to death? Fair answer. At 5:12 a.m., another rescue transmission crackled through Harper's radio. Multiple fatalities confirmed near Frenchtown. Static swallowed the rest. The underground chamber went quiet again. The sheriff lowered the radio slowly, then looked around the shelter one more time. The airflow, the stable heat, the stored food, the hidden mountain ventilation. Understanding finally settled across his face. This place could have saved people. Mason stared toward the stove. Yeah, above them, Montana kept freezing. Entire neighborhoods across Missoula County still sat without power. Emergency shelters overflowed downtown near the Adams Center. Propane shortages hit Reserve Street before midnight. Families burned furniture for heat in some places west of Lolo. But here beneath Blue Mountain, Owen Reed's shelter kept breathing steadily through the storm. Sheriff Harper rubbed one hand across his beard slowly. County Emergency Management needs to see this. Claire almost laughed quietly. Owen tried showing them. The sheriff looked up sharply. What? He presented the design 2 years ago. Claire nodded toward the notebook. They called him paranoid. Harper stared at the engineering diagrams spread across the table, then toward the reinforced chamber surrounding them. Outside, wind screamed across the ridge again, but underground the lantern flames barely moved. At 5:42 a.m., dawn finally touched western Montana. Thin, pale light filtered faintly through the upper ventilation shaft, while the blizzard weakened enough for visibility to return across the mountainside. Rescue crews outside continued digging trapped vehicles from Highway 93, while emergency alerts echoed across county radio channels nonstop. Inside the shelter, though, time moved differently. Slower, steadier, almost peaceful. Atlas slept beside Mason's boots while the former soldier sat quietly studying Owen's notebook again. One page remained open near the center. Thermal Community Network Possibility. Blue Mountain Lolo Ridge South Hills. Owen hadn't planned one shelter. He planned dozens. The sheriff noticed it too. He wanted to build more? Mason nodded slowly. He knew winters were getting worse. Harper stared around the underground chamber another long moment. Then he looked directly at Mason. When this storm ends, he hesitated. People are gonna need to see this place. Mason didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Atlas first. The old shepherd slept hard now, finally relaxed after days of guarding tunnels, fighting exhaustion, and dragging people back from collapsing dirt. Then Mason looked around the shelter Owen built beneath the mountain. The future his brother died, trying to prove mattered. Above ground, they called Owen Reed crazy. But beneath the earth, his idea was the only thing keeping them alive. By mid-morning, the storm had finally weakened enough for daylight to spread across Blue Mountain in pale silver waves. The sky above western Montana still looked bruised and heavy, but the violent whiteout that buried the county for 4 straight days had started pulling east toward the Bitterroot Range. The damage revealed itself slowly. Trees snapped in half, power lines sagging beneath ice. Entire sections of Highway 93 disappeared under frozen drifts taller than pickup trucks. Sheriff Harper stood outside Owen Reed's cabin at 10:14 a.m. staring across the valley below. Missoula looked distant beneath layers of low-gray cloud and smoke from emergency burn barrels rising through neighborhoods still without heat. Behind him, rescue workers dug toward the buried Suburban, where Mason had lived before coming here. One of them shook his head. "You survived this underground?" Mason looked toward the mountain instead of answering. Atlas limped beside him through the snow, refusing to stay inside despite the injured paw. The shepherd's thick coat carried flecks of ice along the back while steam drifted from his muzzle with every breath. People kept staring at the dog, then at the cabin, then at the hidden vent shaft uphill, trying to understand. Claire climbed carefully out from the concealed tunnel entrance, carrying Owen's notebook wrapped inside a canvas tool bag. Eli followed behind her, carrying firewood from the storage shelves underground. The rescue workers stopped talking when they saw the tunnel. One deputy muttered quietly under his breath, "No damn way." Sheriff Harper finally looked at Mason directly. "I called County Emergency Management an hour ago." He nodded toward the shelter entrance. "They're sending people." Mason didn't seem surprised. He just rubbed one hand slowly across Atlas's neck while the dog leaned briefly against his leg. At 11:03 a.m., the first county vehicles arrived. 3 trucks, 1 utility snowcat, and a dark blue county SUV with Missoula Emergency Services stenciled across the side doors. People climbed out carrying clipboards instead of rifles. Different kind of war. A woman in a red parka introduced herself first. Donna Holloway. County Infrastructure Assessment. She barely looked at Mason before her eyes locked onto the hidden ventilation shaft rising through the hillside snow. "Is that connected to the shelter?" Claire answered quietly. "Yes." Dana approached the stone shaft carefully, crouching beside the warm airflow drifting upward through the rocks. She held one gloved hand over the opening, then looked back toward the cabin with visible disbelief. "It's venting naturally." Mason nodded once. "Stack effect." Dana blinked. "You know thermal airflow systems?" "No." Mason looked toward the tunnel entrance. "My brother did." By noon, 6 people stood underground inside Owen Reed's shelter. County officials, rescue workers, 1 engineer from Montana Department of Transportation, who happened to be stranded nearby after the highway closure. And every single one of them reacted exactly the same way when they climbed down the ladder. Silence first, then disbelief. The underground chamber stayed steady at 54 degrees, despite outside temperatures still sitting near -18, with wind chill, no condensation buildup, no smoke accumulation, minimal wood usage. The engineer crouched near the ventilation passage, examining airflow direction with a small handheld meter from his backpack. "This shouldn't work this efficiently." Claire handed him Owen's notebook. "It does." The man flipped through the pages slowly. Soil density charts, heat retention calculations, passive airflow diagrams, emergency storm models. His expression changed page by page. "Oh my God." Dana Holloway stood near the stove, touching the dirt wall carefully. "You're telling me this entire system survived a 4-day polar event using almost no external power?" Mason sat quietly at the table, cleaning mud from one bootlace. My brother built it too. Nobody laughed anymore. Not once. At 12:42 p.m., Sheriff Harper stepped away to take another emergency radio call near the tunnel entrance. His voice echoed faintly through the chamber while the others kept studying Owen's designs. 3 confirmed fatalities west of Lolo. Pause. Generator, fire on reserve. Another pause. Warming shelters over capacity. The underground chamber grew quieter after that, reality catching up. People above ground had nearly frozen inside their own homes, but beneath the mountain, stable air, steady heat, protection. Dana finally closed the notebook slowly. Why didn't anybody listen to him? Claire answered before Mason could. Because he sounded strange. The engineer kept flipping through diagrams near the back pages, then stopped suddenly. Wait. Everyone looked up. He pointed toward a folded map tucked into the notebook's rear sleeve. This isn't just one shelter. Mason already knew, but seeing others realize it changed something. The engineer spread the map carefully across the table. Blue ink lines stretched through different sections of the county surrounding Missoula. Blue Mountain, South Hills, Lolo Creek, targeted elevations, soil composition notes, possible community shelter zones. Owen planned a network. Dana stared at the map speechless. He wanted entire underground thermal systems. Mason nodded once. He knew winters were changing faster than infrastructure could adapt. The county engineer looked around the chamber again, then at the reinforced ventilation. Then, the stable temperature reading still mounted near the wall. Finally, he whispered something almost to himself. This could save lives. Atlas lifted his head briefly from beside the stove, like he agreed. At 1:36 p.m., another truck arrived outside the property. Dark green Ford, Wade Granger. The atmosphere underground changed instantly when Eli noticed the vehicle through the concealed tunnel opening. My uncle's here. Mason stood slowly. Atlas rose beside him despite the injured leg. Claire looked uneasy immediately. Sheriff Harper met Wade outside near the buried cabin, while snow drifted lightly around them. The storm had weakened enough now that the entire valley looked painfully bright beneath frozen sunlight. Wade saw the rescue crews first, then the vent shaft, then Mason emerging from the tunnel beside Atlas. His expression hardened, not surprise, recognition. He knew exactly what this place was. Sheriff Harper crossed his arms. You knew about the shelter. Wade glanced toward Eli standing near the tunnel entrance. That boy talked too much? Nobody had to. Harper nodded toward the underground system. You've been trying to buy this property for years. Wade removed one glove slowly. Because Owen Reed built something valuable, finally. Truth. No mining story, no logging access lie, just survival. Wade looked toward the hidden shaft again. Storms are getting worse every year. He shrugged lightly. Everybody knows it. Not everybody built this, Claire said coldly. Wade ignored her. He stared directly at Mason. Your brother understood something before the rest of us did. Mason said nothing. Wade stepped closer through the snow. I offered him partnership, funding, construction crews. His jaw tightened slightly. He refused because he thought people like me would monetize it. You would, Mason answered quietly. Wade didn't deny it. That silence mattered. Atlas growled low beside Mason's knee. Wade glanced toward the dog. He always this friendly. He decides who deserves it. The wind carried fine snow crystals across the ridge, while rescue crews continued photographing ventilation structures and tunnel entrances nearby. The whole property no longer looked abandoned. It looked important, dangerously important. At 2:11 p.m., Dana Holloway climbed back underground carrying a portable thermal camera. She spent nearly 20 minutes documenting wall temperatures, airflow circulation, and insulation retention, while muttering disbelief under her breath. Finally, she looked toward Mason. You know this shelter used less fuel in 4 days than most homes burn in 6 hours during conditions like this? Mason looked toward Owen's notebook again. He knew. Dana nodded slowly. No. She glanced around the chamber. Your brother proved it. That landed differently. Because all week people kept saying Owen believed things, thought things, imagined things. But science didn't care about belief. The shelter existed. The storm happened, and Owen Reed's design worked. By late afternoon, word had already spread through parts of Missoula County emergency channels. Rescue crews started referring to the place simply as the Reed Shelter. People arrived just to see it. Deputies, engineers, volunteer firefighters. One exhausted paramedic from St. Patrick Hospital climbed down the ladder around 4 or 5 p.m. after working 40 straight hours during the blackout. The man sat near the stove and nearly cried when warm air hit his face. You have no idea what it's like up there right now. Nobody answered, because they did know. That's why this place mattered. Atlas slept most of the afternoon beside the stove, while strangers walked carefully around the chamber, studying Owen's work. Every once in a while, the shepherd opened one eye toward unfamiliar footsteps before settling again beside Mason's chair, still guarding, always guarding. At 5:27 p.m., Claire found Mason alone near the rear tunnel studying one section of Owen's notebook again. Cassette tape references, dates, coordinates, personal notes. You okay? Mason stared at the page a long second before answering. He knew he was dying. Claire stayed quiet. Mason tapped one line lightly with his thumb. If they won't listen now, maybe they will after the first real winter. The underground chamber hummed softly around them with moving air and quiet voices. Above ground, the mountain slowly disappeared beneath evening again. Claire leaned against the tunnel wall. You know what's funny? Mason looked up. Owen used to tell me this place wasn't about hiding from the world. She smiled faintly. He said it was about surviving long enough to rebuild it smarter. Mason looked around the shelter again. The reinforced walls, the stable warmth, the careful engineering, and for the first time since returning to Montana, he stopped seeing the chamber as a dead man's obsession. He saw intention. Legacy. Atlas limped over slowly, then rested his head against Mason's knee. Outside, western Montana still struggled through blackout conditions and frozen roads. But underground, Owen Reed's idea kept breathing steadily beneath the mountain. And now the whole county finally understood what they almost lost when they laughed at the man who built it. Winter loosened its grip slowly over western Montana, not all at once. The snow along Blue Mountain melted in layers, shrinking week by week beneath pale March sunlight, while runoff crept down the hillsides toward the Blackfoot River. Roads reopened gradually. Utility crews repaired damaged power lines along Highway 12. Downtown, Missoula filled again with traffic, coffee steam, and people pretending life had returned to normal. But some things didn't go back, not after that storm. At 7:08 a.m., one cold spring morning, Mason stood outside the cabin, watching fog drift low through the pine trees while Atlas limped carefully through patches of melting snow nearby. The shepherd still favored the injured leg. Permanent now. The vet at Prine Veterinary Hospital told Mason the damage healed as well as it could, but arthritis would settle into the joint eventually. Atlas never complained. Dogs like him rarely did. Mason crouched beside the old military dog and tightened the strap on his weathered harness. You earned that limp. Atlas leaned briefly into his chest, then wandered toward the ridge again to patrol the property out of habit, always working. Below the mountain, change spread through Missoula County faster than Mason expected. First came the engineers, then county planners, then emergency preparedness groups from Helena and Bozeman, asking questions about underground thermal systems. Dana Holloway returned twice a week, now carrying survey equipment and folders thick with environmental reports. The county even gave the shelter a formal designation, Read Passive Survival Model Case File. MC-17B Mason hated the name immediately. Sounded too clean, too official. Too far removed from the lonely man who spent years freezing his hands, raw, digging tunnels while people called him insane. One afternoon near the end of March, a group of veterans from Fort Harrison, VA, arrived in 2 dusty SUVs to see the shelter themselves. Most of them walked slowly. Old knees, old injuries. Faces carrying that same distant 1,000-yard stare Mason recognized without needing introductions. One man named Curtis stopped halfway down the ladder underground and simply stood there breathing the warm, stable air. "No generators," he muttered. "Nope," Mason answered. "No propane?" "Barely." Curtis looked around the shelter carefully, then laughed once under his breath. "Hell," he shook his head slowly. "This place makes more sense than half the government housing they stick vets in." The others nodded quietly. Atlas walked among them, slowly accepting cautious pets from rough old hands, smelling faintly of tobacco, diesel fuel, and winter gloves. The shepherd moved differently around veterans, calmer somehow, like he recognized familiar damage. Maybe he did. At 2:41 p.m. that same day, one of the men noticed the cassette tapes stacked neatly beside Owen's notebook. "What's on those?" Mason stared at the tapes a moment. He hadn't listened yet. Not fully. The tapes sat inside an old green ammo can Owen stored beneath the workbench near the rear tunnel. Each one carried handwritten dates in black marker. Jan 14 FB, the Siouan March projections. "If something happens to me," that last label stayed with Mason longest. That night, after everyone left, the shelter felt unusually quiet. Snowmelt dripped steadily somewhere beyond the ventilation tunnel, while lantern light flickered softly against the dirt walls. Atlas slept beside the stove, twitching occasionally through old working dog dreams. Mason sat alone at the table around 10:16 p.m., holding one cassette in his hand. Claire had found an old battery-powered player earlier that afternoon inside Owen's storage crates. Still worked. Barely. The tape hissed softly when Mason pressed play. Then Owen's voice filled the underground chamber for the first time since his death. Calm, measured, tired. "If you're hearing this, then either the shelter worked." Static crackled briefly. "Or I finally ran out of time." Mason froze completely. Atlas lifted his head immediately at the unfamiliar voice. Mason swallowed once hard but kept listening. The frost line shifted another 8 inches this year. Nobody at the county board cared. Owen coughed quietly somewhere on the recording. "People still think I'm building a bunker because I'm scared of the world." Small pause. "That's not it." The tape hummed softly beneath the mountain air. "I'm scared the winters are changing faster than people can adapt." Mason stared at the lantern flame while Owen's voice echoed gently through the shelter he built with his own hands. "I spent 14 years engineering mining ventilation systems underground." Another cough. Longer this time. "The math isn't complicated. Stable earth temperatures, passive airflow, heat retention. The land already solves half the survival problem if people stop fighting it." Atlas slowly rested his chin against Mason's boot, grounding again. The tape continued. "Doctors at St. Patrick found the cancer too late." Owen laughed quietly once without humor. "Funny thing is, I'm not afraid of dying." Mason shut his eyes briefly. Above them, snow slid softly from pine branches somewhere outside. "I'm afraid nobody listens before the next bad winter comes." The recording clicked softly before ending. That silence afterward felt heavier than the tape itself. Mason sat motionless a long time, then rewound it and listened again. Over the next few weeks, spring settled deeper across Missoula County. Mud replaced snow along Blue Mountain Road. Meltwater carved narrow streams through the property. Birds returned gradually to the trees around the cabin, while Atlas resumed slow patrols through the hillside despite the limp. The shelter changed too. Not structurally, emotionally. People came constantly now. Engineers, students from the University of Montana, emergency planners, wildfire preparedness crews. A documentary team from Spokane even asked to film the tunnel system before Mason told them no and shut the trapdoor in their faces. Some things still belonged to Owen. Not the cameras. Never the cameras. At 11:32 a.m., one rainy April morning, Sheriff Harper arrived carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes from the county records office. Found these in emergency planning storage. Inside were copies of Owen's rejected proposals, thermal shelter concepts, passive heating reports, climate adaptation studies, most stamped denied or not feasible in thick, red ink. Claire flipped through them silently, then stopped. At the bottom of one rejection form, someone had handwritten a note. Subject appears paranoid. Recommend no further review. Mason stared at the sentence quietly. No anger left in it anymore. Just weight. Atlas limped over beside him and laid his head across Mason's knee beneath the table. The sheriff exhaled slowly. County board wants to issue a formal statement. About what? Harper looked uncomfortable. About Owen. Mason almost smiled. Too late for apologies. Harper didn't argue, because he knew it too. By May, construction crews began testing small underground emergency shelters outside several rural communities near Lolo and Frenchtown, using modified versions of Owen's ventilation system. Dana Holloway called Mason 3 separate times, asking technical questions he couldn't answer. My brother built it, he reminded her every time. Still, they kept coming back, because the shelter worked. That truth mattered more than pride now. One evening around sunset, Mason climbed the ridge above the cabin, carrying another cassette tape player, while Atlas followed slowly beside him, through wet grass and lingering snow patches. The valley below glowed gold beneath fading light. Missoula looked peaceful from here, ordinary. Nobody seeing it from a distance would guess how close parts of the county came to freezing apart that winter. Mason sat beside the vent shaft, while Atlas settled next to him with a grunt. Then Mason played the final tape. Owen's voice returned softer this time, weak. If Mason ever comes back here, long pause, tell him I'm sorry I stopped calling. Mason looked down at the dirt. I figured he needed distance after Afghanistan. Another cough. Truth is, I probably needed it too. The wind moved gently through the pines around them. I know what it feels like when people look at you like something came home wrong. Mason pressed one hand slowly against his mouth. Below them, warm air drifted steadily upward through the hidden shaft beneath the mountain. Still breathing. I hope he keeps Atlas with him. Owen laughed faintly. Dog always liked him better anyway. Atlas lifted one ear at his name. Then the tape reached its final lines. If the shelter works, maybe people survive long enough to treat each other better. Static swallowed the rest. The tape clicked empty. Mason sat there until darkness covered the valley completely. No movement, no words. Just one hand resting against Atlas's neck while warm air rose quietly from the earth beneath them. By early summer, people across Missoula County started calling the underground system simply Reed Design. Not bunker, not tunnel, not survival hole. Design. The word carried respect now. And somewhere inside that change, Mason noticed something strange happening to himself too. The nightmares still came. Some nights rotor sounds from medical helicopters crossing downtown. Missoula still dragged him awake, reaching for weapons that weren't there anymore. Sudden metallic noises still tightened every muscle in his body before his brain caught up. But now, Atlas no longer had to physically climb onto his chest to ground him afterward. Sometimes, Mason just listened to the shelter, breathing through the vents instead, and slowly came back on his own. One evening around 8:47 p.m., Claire found him sitting outside the cabin, watching sunset burn orange across Blue Mountain. You know, she said quietly, people in town finally stopped calling Owen crazy. Mason stared toward the valley below. Doesn't help him much now. No. Claire looked toward the hidden vent shaft nearby. But it might help the next person everybody ignores. That stayed with him. Long after the sun disappeared. Long after the mountain cooled beneath nightfall. And far below them, hidden safely beneath the earth. Owen Reed trusted more than people. The shelter kept breathing steadily into another season. By the time winter returned to western Montana, the valley looked different. Not dramatically, not from the highway anyway. Drivers coming south along Highway 93 still saw the same pine-covered ridges, same ranch fences, same smoke drifting from chimneys above scattered homes outside Missoula. But beneath the snow, things had changed at 5:42 a.m. On the first hard freeze of December, thin streams of smoke curled quietly upward from stone ventilation shafts, scattered across Blue Mountain like hidden campfires beneath the earth. One near Lolo Creek, two beyond Miller Peak Road, another beside a veteran housing project west of Reserve Street. Small signs, easy to miss, unless you knew what they meant. Inside the original shelter beneath Owen Reed's cabin, the temperature held steady at 53 degrees, while snow tapped softly against the buried roof overhead. The mountain breathed around them. Mason woke slowly to the sound of Atlas shifting near the stove. Not panic, not survival reflex, just the old shepherd dreaming again. For years, Mason used to wake violently, heart pounding, hand reaching for weapons before his eyes even opened. Helicopter sounds from the VA hospital flights near Missoula used to drag him straight back into Helmand Province before dawn. Now, different. Not perfect, but different. He sat up on the cot and rubbed one hand across his face, while warm lantern light flickered softly against the dirt walls. Atlas lifted his head immediately when Mason's boots touched the floor. The shepherd's muzzle had turned almost fully gray now, age finally winning small battles. His limp stayed permanent too. Cold mornings made it worse. Some days the dog climbed the ladder slower than Mason did. Still refused to help, though, always. Mason crouched beside him and adjusted the blanket near the stove. "You stubborn old bastard." Atlas thumped his tail once against the floor. Outside, wind swept softly through Blue Mountain pines while snow drifted deeper across the hidden cabin above them. The old structure still looked half-abandoned from a distance. Mason kept it that way intentionally. The cabin wasn't the home, never had been. At 6:11 a.m., the coffee kettle rattled gently atop the stove while Mason opened the upper vent, controls another inch to increase airflow. The underground chamber smelled faintly of cedar smoke, old canvas, and brewing coffee. Familiar smells now, home smells. That realization still surprised him sometimes. Claire arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying supply boxes down the ladder with practiced ease. No hesitation anymore. The underground tunnels didn't feel strange to locals now. Not after last winter. She set a paper bag from Le Petit Outre Bakery onto the table. Got the last cinnamon rolls before church crowd hit downtown. Mason checked the receipt absent-mindedly. 11:47, still warm. Claire glanced toward Atlas. "How's the leg?" "Same." Atlas rested his head briefly against her knee while she scratched behind one ear carefully. The shepherd had become something of a local legend around Missoula County over the past year. Kids at the Fort Missoula Veteran Outreach Center painted his picture on one wall beside the words, "He found the future first." Mason hated the mural. Atlas probably would've too. Around 8:30 a.m., the first snow advisory warning rolled across county emergency radio frequencies. Polar front incoming. Heavy accumulation expected. Temperatures dropping fast overnight. 1 year ago, those warnings triggered panic across western Montana. This year, people prepared differently. Families checked vent shafts, stocked underground shelves, inspected passive airflow tunnels. Some of the newer shelter systems weren't perfect yet. A few leaked condensation. Others still needed reinforcement supports. But the idea itself had spread faster than anyone expected, especially among veterans. The Reed Transitional Housing Project Opened outside Missoula 3 months earlier, using modified underground thermal units for homeless veterans struggling through Montana winters. Mason visited once during construction and left before reporters arrived. Too many cameras, too many questions. But he noticed something before leaving. Men sleeping there actually rested. No generators roaring all night, no freezing cots, no thin motel walls shaking every time a truck passed outside. Just quiet warmth beneath the earth that mattered. At 10:04 a.m., Sheriff Harper stopped by the cabin carrying a stack of counter permit folders beneath one arm. Got another 6 applications for thermal shelters. Mason looked up from repairing one of Atlas's harness straps. People still think I know what I'm doing. Harper laughed quietly. Close enough. The sheriff looked older now. Last winter aged most people around here a little faster. But his eyes settled differently on the shelter these days. Respect instead of curiosity. He handed Mason one newspaper clipping from the Missoulian, folded neatly in half. Headline: Montana Counties study read design after record winter losses. Below the article sat an old photograph of Owen outside the cabin years earlier. Beard longer. Thin from chemotherapy, nobody knew he was hiding. Dirt on both hands. Still digging. Still building. Claire read the article silently beside the stove. They finally got his picture right. Mason looked at the photo a long moment. Most people never saw Owen correctly while he was alive. Too quiet, too strange, too obsessed. Funny how survival changes public opinion. Outside, snowfall thickened steadily across Blue Mountain by early afternoon. Wind pushed white curtains through the trees, while temperatures dropped fast enough to frost the inside edges of the cabin windows upstairs. Atlas noticed the storm first, always did. The old shepherd climbed carefully toward the upper ladder entrance and sat facing the trapdoor listening to the wind above. Working again, even now. Mason followed him halfway up and opened the outer hatch briefly. Cold air rushed downward instantly. Hard freeze coming. Below the mountain, scattered vent shafts across the valley already carried thin ribbons of smoke upward into the storm. Proof of life. Proof Owen was right. At 2:18 p.m., Mason drove into Missoula for supplies one final time before roads worsened overnight. The old Suburban still rattled badly climbing icy sections near Brook Street. But the heater worked again thanks to a mechanic named Luis, who refused payment after learning whose vehicle it was. Downtown looked busy despite the weather. Holiday lights glowed across storefront windows. People hurried between coffee shops carrying scarves and grocery bags while snow dusted parked trucks along Higgins Avenue. Normal life. Mason stopped at a small hardware store near South Reserve, where thermal pipe fittings sold out almost completely. The cashier recognized him immediately. "You're the Reed guy." Mason almost turned around right there. Instead, he nodded once and paid for supplies silently. $43.82, exact cash. Outside the store, a younger veteran smoking beside the sidewalk called out quietly before Mason reached the Suburban. "Hey." Mason looked back. The guy couldn't have been older than 30. Marine Corps hoodie. Prosthetic left leg beneath heavy jeans. He nodded toward the snow falling over Missoula. "That shelter thing your brother built," small pause, "saved my ass last February." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded again. Sometimes that's enough. By sunset, the storm fully returned. Snow hammered Blue Mountain hard after dark, while wind curled through the trees surrounding the cabin exactly like the previous year. But this time the valley responded differently. No panic buying, no desperate generator hunts, no overloaded emergency shelters downtown. Families climbed underground calmly instead. Trapdoors closed, lanterns lit, life continued beneath the earth. Inside Owen's original shelter, Mason sat beside the stove around 9:44 p.m., listening to soft wind vibrations move harmlessly across the mountain overhead. Atlas slept nearby wrapped in 2 old army wool blankets. The shepherd snored now, Age again. Claire laughed softly every time she heard it. Mason reached automatically beneath the cot for the combat knife he used to keep there every night out of reflex. Then stopped. The space beneath the bed stayed empty now, had been for months. He sat quietly a long moment after realizing it. No knife, no pistol beside the pillow, no boots laced for emergency movement. Outside the storm deepened, but underground, safe. Atlas opened one eye sleepily toward him, then settled again beside the warmth. At 11:07 p.m., the county emergency radio crackled faintly through static near the workbench. All thermal shelter systems operational. Pause. Roads closed west of Lolo Pass. Another pause. No cold weather fatalities reported at this time. Mason leaned back slowly against the dirt wall, listening to the shelter breathe around him. Airflow steady, temperature stable, mountain holding. Above them, snow-buried Blue Mountain beneath another brutal Montana winter. But this time, people survived differently, because one quiet man everybody mocked listened to the land more carefully than the noise around him. Near midnight, Mason climbed the ladder alone and stepped outside briefly into the storm. Snow whipped sideways across the ridge, beneath moonlight hidden somewhere behind thick clouds. The valley below disappeared almost completely beneath white drifting darkness, except for the smoke. Thin lines rising gently from scattered vent shafts hidden throughout the mountain communities below. Dozens now, maybe more. The valley looked alive beneath the storm. Atlas appeared behind Mason a minute later, despite the bad leg and freezing wind. The old shepherd stood beside him, silently staring across the snow-covered darkness below. Two survivors, still here. Mason rested one hand gently against the dog's neck while warm air drifted upward from the hidden shelter beneath their feet. A year earlier, he arrived in Missoula, sleeping inside a dying Suburban, with nowhere left to go except a dead brother's collapsing cabin. Now, people crossed the county to study the shelter Owen built beneath the earth. Veterans slept safely through winter because of it. Families stayed warm because of it. And somewhere inside all that change, Mason finally stopped feeling like a man stranded between wars. The wind howled softly across Blue Mountain. Atlas leaned against his leg, and below them, hidden safely beneath the snow and stone, Owen Reed's shelter kept breathing steadily through another Montana winter. People in Missoula used to say Owen Reed buried himself because he was afraid of the world. But the truth was simpler than that. He listened to the land before anyone else did, and in the end, the man they called crazy built the only home strong enough to survive the storm. If this story meant something to you, let us know where you're watching from. And tell us, do you think people listen too late to the ones who see the truth first? Maybe that was always the real tragedy. Not the cold, not the storm, not even the years Owen Reed spent alone beneath that mountain. Maybe the hardest thing is how quickly people decide someone is broken just because they live differently, speak differently, or carry pain in ways the world doesn't understand. A homeless veteran sleeping inside an old Suburban, an aging German shepherd with scars in his paws, a quiet man digging tunnels beneath frozen ground while the town laughed at him. Most people looked at them and saw failure, but the mountain saw something else. It saw loyalty, persistence. Men and animals still standing after life had already tried to bury them both. And maybe that's worth remembering. Because sometimes the people who look the most damaged are the very ones holding the knowledge, the kindness, or the strength that ends up saving everybody else. Long after the snow-covered Blue Mountain again, the shelter beneath that cabin kept breathing quietly through the earth, warm, steady, alive, just like the people inside it. If this story made you believe that every person deserves to be seen with dignity, comment 1 below. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.